If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 41, The Supply Agreement. As soon as Samwell finished his bath, he heard a series of footsteps approaching from outside his room. Guessing that it was a servant sent by Lord Brandon to escort him to dinner, he quickly buttoned his clothes. Right on time, he heard a knock at the door. "Sir Caesar, the Lord has sent me to escort you to the banquet." Samwell opened the door and, while fastening his last few buttons, smiled at the maid waiting outside. "Lead the way, please." He followed the servant down a dim corridor until they arrived at a large oak door with silver inlay. "Sir, the banquet will start shortly, but you may rest in the lounge until then." "All right." Samwell pushed open the door and entered the room. However, he was immediately struck by the decor in front of him. Pink curtains, a snow-white wool rug, a luxurious ivory bed, and a delicate vanity. This wasn't a lounge at all, it was clearly the bedroom of a lady or a noblewoman. Startled, Samwell turned back to leave, but found that the door had already been locked from the outside. At that moment, a crisp voice echoed from within the room. "Well, Sir Caesar, you are quite bold barging into my bedroom like this." Only then did Samwell notice a young woman emerging from an inner chamber, eyeing him with an amused expression. Alice Q.E. The Viscount's daughter was wearing an unusually daring gown, though her figure was so round that it strained the fabric, making her attire appear more awkward than elegant. Her face, round and freckled, was layered with heavy makeup that struggled to conceal the blemishes beneath. Samwell quickly averted his gaze, keeping his head down. "Forgive me, Lady Alice. A servant informed me this was a lounge. She must have made a mistake. I'll take my leave now." "Oh, but don't go. Sir Caesar, I heard from father that you're a valiant knight who's managed to bring thousands of wildlings to heel. Come, tell me about your adventures." Watching her rushing toward him, Samwell realized all too well that this was a trap, set up to force him into a compromising situation. Blasted Brandon Q.E. Just because your daughter can't find a suitor doesn't mean you can force a match like this. Panicking, Samwell summoned all his strength and yanked at the door. With a loud crack, he broke the latch thanks to his enhanced strength, which had reached 2.73. The door swung open, and Samwell quickly slipped through, avoiding the young lady's not-so-subtle advances. Just as he exhaled in relief, he nearly collided with a surprised Brandon around the corner. For a brief moment, the air was thick with tension. Samwell quickly took the initiative and spoke first. "My apologies, Lord Q.E. I accidentally damaged the door. I apologize." Brandon, who had come to catch them in the act, looked at the fully dressed Samwell, clearly at a loss. He finally glared at his daughter, as if to say, "How could you let him escape so easily?" Lady Alice, looking hurt and frustrated, huffed and stormed back into her room. "Ahem, no worries," the Lord said, composing himself. "The door isn't a problem, Sir Caesar. The banquet is about to start. Let's be on our way." "Certainly." The two walked side by side, both making a silent agreement to act as if nothing had happened, quickly returning to light-hearted conversation. "So, Sir Caesar, what brings you to the Arbor?" "Well, as you know, the Red Mountains are a harsh, barren place. If my territory is to thrive, we'll need to purchase grain and other supplies from outside. My goal on this journey is to secure a supply agreement with House Redwine." Brandon gave him a sideways glance, a bit of a smirk in his expression, as if amused by Samwell's naivety. "Perhaps I should remind you, young knight, that relying on external sources for food and supplies to support a territory can be a very costly endeavor." Samwell spoke with ease, shrugging off the challenge. "I understand that, my lord. Luckily, I recently discovered a silver mine in my territory, so—" "A silver mine?" Brandon's expression shifted from skepticism to envy. "Fortune must truly smile upon you." "All thanks to the seven," Samwell replied, crossing himself with a seven-pointed star over his chest before falling silent. As he anticipated, it didn't take long before Brandon couldn't resist probing further. "Why not avoid the Arbor altogether?" he offered. "Here in Sunhouse, we can supply food and other goods. We're much closer, which means we can save you a significant amount on transport costs." Samwell smiled inwardly, though he showed a hesitant expression. "Well, the issue is that I have over 10,000 people to support and that number is likely to increase." "Are you sure you can handle such a demand?" "Of course," Brandon said confidently. The land surrounding Sunflower Hall is incredibly fertile. You're welcome to see it yourself. Wheat, vegetables, and orchards as far as the eye can see. I could easily supply not only 10,000 people but up to 30,000. So, 30,000 is your upper limit, Samwell thought as he stroked his chin. Alright, let's talk about pricing then. I'll guarantee you a fair price. Brandon replied, adopting the manner of an eager merchant. I'll have my steward draft a price list. If you're not satisfied, we can negotiate directly. Well, then, my lord, if you can guarantee a fair price, I'll make Sunhouse my main supplier. An excellent decision. But I have a condition, Samwell added, cutting off the Viscount's self-congratulatory boasting. A condition? You're aware, I assume, that I'll need royal permission to mine the silver I have. I've already sent a messenger to King's Landing for authorization, but that could take time. In addition, the mine needs to be organized, refined, and prepared to mint the silver, which also takes time. Samwell spread his hands in a shrug. So, I may not be able to pay you right away for these initial supplies. If you're willing to accept a delay in payment, we have a deal. A delay? Brandon's brow furrowed. How long? 6 months. 6 months. Brandon nearly choked. Absolutely not. But after a moment's thought, his eyes glinted, and he softened his tone. However, if you're willing to marry my daughter, then I'd be open to such an arrangement. Samwell's lip twitched. With your daughter? I'd pass even if you threw in 6 months of free supplies. I understand your concerns, Samwell said, feigning indifference. Which is why I didn't bring this up with you in the first place. House Redwine has deep coffers, a 6-month deferment would be a mere trifle for them. This remark made Brandon grit his teeth. After a long pause, he finally responded. 3 months, and not a day longer. By then, your silver mine should surely be producing. 3 months. Samwell made a show of thinking it over, then nodded with a sigh. Very well, my lord, 3 months it is. But I'll need the first shipment of supplies within 3 days. Done. The Viscount agreed immediately. We'll draft up the supply list after dinner. Good. Samwell grinned, extending his hand. To a prosperous partnership. A prosperous partnership. Brandon shook Samwell's hand with enthusiasm, then gave him a knowing smile. You're quite the skilled negotiator, Sir Caesar. As are you, my lord, Samwell replied, his smile as broad as ever. Brandon leaned in, unwilling to give up entirely. Remember, if you're open to marrying my daughter, I could give you those 3 months of supplies for free. I'm sorry, my lord, Samwell answered with an earnest look. But I swore an oath to myself no marriage until I've truly built my own lands. Brandon could only sigh and drop the matter. Chapter 42, Arbor Island. After spending 3 days in Sunhouse, watching ships loaded with food and supplies set sail towards Eagle's Beak, Samwell finally felt a bit relieved and formally bid farewell to Viscount Brandon QE. Thus, amid Brandon's warm send-off and Alice's disappointed gaze, Samwell and his entourage boarded a ship bound for Arbor Island and set sail. The journey was smooth, and just 6 days later, their ship crossed the Redwine Straits and reached Arbor Island. The island is famous for its vineyards, producing the coveted Arbor Gold, a wine prized by the Seven Kingdoms nobility and known for its premium price earning the title of liquid gold. But it wasn't wine alone that made House Redwine one of the Reach's most influential families, it was the Arbor Fleet. This fleet, alongside the Royal Fleet and the Iron Fleet, is among the top 3 naval forces in Westeros, capable of influencing the Seven Kingdoms' politics. Under the afternoon sun, Samwell walked off the gangplank at a measured pace. The bustling docks were filled with laborers hauling bags of goods onto merchant ships, shouting their work songs loudly as they loaded cargo. Watching the scene, Samwell's guards couldn't help but show nostalgia. Just half a year ago, they had been like those laborers, working tirelessly with heavy cargo and barely earning enough to eat. Now, their fates had changed entirely. Thinking of this, the guards looked at their lord with admiration and loyalty. Samwell's arrival, however, did not cause a stir. Although Todd Flower had sent a letter ahead explaining the purpose of their visit, Samwell's current reputation wasn't enough to earn a grand welcome from House Redwine. In fact, no family members came to greet them at all, they only sent a servant. This treatment was a bit of a slight. Even after Samwell entered the castle and spent half a day drinking tea in the reception hall, he still hadn't met Lord Pakester Redwine. By now, even Todd Florent looked deeply offended. However, Samwell still appeared calm and indifferent. In truth, Samwell had expected this cold reception. Given that, according to Lady Olenna's original plans, Eagle's Nest was technically meant to be his but was supposed to be under House Redwine's control. Now that he had defied their arrangement, it wasn't surprising Pakester Redwine would show him a bit of attitude. But he was in no rush. Having secured a supply agreement with Sun House's Viscount Huey, the immediate food shortage in his lands was addressed, so he wasn't as dependent on Redwine's support as before. As for the brandy, he wasn't desperate for Redwine's help in selling it. Of course, the Redwines would have been an ideal partner. They had well-established distribution channels and could swiftly bring brandy to the tables of Westerosi nobility. Marketing it under the Arbor Island name would also make it easier to build a reputation for brandy. But if House Redwine didn't want to cooperate, there were always alternatives. With this in mind, Samwell felt no urgency and watched calmly to see what Pakester Redwine might do next. Only as the sun began to set did someone finally enter the reception hall. "Oh, so dark in here. Someone bring some candles." Apologies, Samwell, for making you wait so long." The visitors were Pakester's twin sons, Horace and Hobber Redwine. The brothers looked nearly identical, square faces, orange hair, and freckled cheeks. However, they were easy to tell apart. The elder, Horace, was taller with a sharp, aggressive gaze that seemed to challenge everyone. The younger, Hobber, spoke with a slur, as if his mouth was perpetually full of water. "No worries, the journey was long, so we've had time to rest up," Samwell replied with a light smile. Horace stared at Samwell for a while and said, "Samwell, you've changed a lot over the years." Hobber nodded in agreement, "Yet, lost a lot of weight. Have you not been eating well lately?" Horace immediately added, "In a desolate place like the Red Mountains, I imagine it's hard to get a decent meal, haha." As they laughed, Samwell watched the two brothers with an indifferent smile, as if he were watching a couple of fools. Fragments of memories belonging to the original Samwell surfaced, reminding him that he actually had some history with the Redwine twins. Back when Lord Randall Tarley hadn't entirely given up on his eldest son, he had taken Samwell to Arbor Island, hoping to arrange a marriage between Samwell and Pakester's daughter, Dismira Redwine. But unfortunately, young Samwell didn't live up to expectations, failing to win Lord Pakester's favour and crying miserably after Horace and Hobber ridiculed him. It had been a humiliating memory. "It's true, it's easy to go hungry there," Samwell answered without taking their mockery to heart. "That's why I came to Arbor Island, hoping to secure House Redwine's support in providing food and supplies for Eagle's Eyrie." Although he already had a supply agreement with Sun House, Samwell wouldn't mind a second supplier. After all, relying solely on House QE could be risky. If Lord Brandon decided to break the deal one day or insisted on pressing the marriage with Alice, what then? "Well," Horace smiled slyly, "let's wait for my father to discuss that. Is Lord Redwine not on the island?" "Oh, he's here, but he's off touring the lands right now." "When will he return?" "It's hard to say, it could be tomorrow or next week. Arbor Island is so large, I'm not sure where he is at the moment." Listening to this, Samwell kept his smile but mentally cursed them. "In that case, we won't intrude. We have other matters and will likely leave tomorrow." "You're leaving tomorrow?" Horace seemed taken aback by Samwell's declaration. "Yes." Samwell smiled. "I still need to visit Oldtown. Will you be stopping by Arbor Island on your way back?" Hobber quickly asked. "Depends on how things go," Samwell replied, showing a hint of indifference, "perhaps if we have time. I do hope Lord Pakester is available then." Horace's expression shifted, and after a pause, he forced a smile. "Well then, I'll have rooms prepared for you to rest." "Thanks, I appreciate it." Samwell strode confidently out of the room, causing the Redwine twins to exchange surprised glances. But soon, they shared a wordless look and sped up to walk alongside Samwell. The hallway doors were narrow, barely allowing two to pass shoulder to shoulder. But the twins didn't step aside, instead moving in unison to crowd him. Thunk! With one powerful motion, Samwell stepped out the door, leaving the two brothers stumbling, nearly falling over. "Oh! I'm so sorry, are you two all right?" Samwell feigned surprise, turning back. Horace, gritting his teeth against the pain and shock, forced a grin. "No worries. We just tripped." "Ah, so it was." Samwell nodded with understanding. I thought maybe you two hadn't eaten enough. Ignoring their reddening faces, he strode ahead without looking back. Chapter 43, Importance. Night fell deep, shrouding the castle, while the study remained brightly lit by candles. Supposedly out surveying his lands, Lord Pakester Redwine was in fact seated in his study, listening intently as Todd Flower recounted the developments of the Eagle's Beak outpost. When Todd reached the part about Samwell holding off 2,000 wildlings with only 100 new recruits, Horace, standing nearby, couldn't contain himself and burst out. Impossible. No way. 100 raw recruits holding back 2,000 wildlings? Todd, that's absurd. Before Todd could respond, Lord Pakester gave his eldest son a sharp look. Silence. Horace clammed up immediately. Lord Pakester may have been small and slight, all but swallowed by his large chair, but no one in the room dared ignore the formidable lord of the Arbor. Even Mace Tyrell, Warden of the South, had gone out of his way to secure this man's allegiance by marrying him to Mace's own sister, Mina Tyrell. Todd, continue. Yes, my lord, Todd replied, resuming his account. From the surrender of Tiger Fang, the ambush against the allied tribes, to the discovery of silver and the distilling of brandy, Horace and Hobber Redwine looked more and more skeptical, as if hearing some ghostly tale. No story they'd ever heard sounded this far-fetched. The twins could hardly believe it. The same Samwell who'd once been bullied to tears by them had somehow transformed into a determined knight, successfully carving out a domain in the harsh Red Mountains. The brothers struggled to process it, with Horace massaging his still aching shoulder from the prior evening, silently raging that it had to be lies, all lies. Finally, Todd concluded his report. Horace turned to his father, desperate to speak his mind, but seeing Lord Pakester's lowered gaze and somber expression, he bit his tongue. The study fell into a long silence, broken only by the occasional crackling of the candles. After what felt like an age, Lord Pakester raised his head, his expression unreadable. Is securing supplies his only reason for visiting the Arbor? Actually, my lord, Todd answered, Sir Samwell has already secured a supply contract with Lord Brandon of Sunhouse, so he may not be in dire need of provisions from the Arbor. But with the brandy, he does seem to want to forge a partnership with the Redwines. Brandy? Lord Pakester mused, arching an eyebrow. Did you bring any? Let me taste this brandy that's supposedly so outstanding. Yes, I did, my lord. Todd produced a small cask, pouring a measure for Lord Pakester. A potent aroma filled the room, and Lord Pakester straightened at once, captivated by the scent alone. After scrutinizing the amber liquid, he raised the glass, savoring its fragrance. Excellent. Before even tasting it, he'd made up his mind. The guests in the room, eyes wide, shared a mix of surprise and envy at this unexpected display. Lord Pakester took a sip, closing his eyes, seeming to linger on the taste. At last, he looked over to his eldest son. Horace, you will bring Samwell to me first thing in the morning. Yes, father, Horace agreed instantly, casting an eager look at Todd's cask, clearly hoping for a taste. But before he could ask, Lord Pakester ordered, all the brandy remaining in that cask goes directly to the vineyard. The winemakers need to examine it and see if they can figure out how it's distilled. Yes, my lord. Todd, watching the others' envious expressions, closed the cask without protest. Take it there immediately, Lord Pakester added. Todd left the study. He'd served the Arbor for years, but this moment reminded him starkly no matter how much he gave, he'd always be a bastard, a man apart. The candlelit corridor outside flickered with shadows both familiar and unfamiliar. With a sigh, Todd steadied himself and set off toward the vineyards. Early the next morning. After breakfast, Samwell finished dressing and, without so much as a word to the Redwines, led his men to the docks, where they found a departing ship bound for Oldtown. After paying his fare, Samwell watched as the large anchor was raised, and they set off from port. Standing on deck, Todd Flowers was stunned. Where was Horace Redwine? Did Lord Pakester perhaps change his mind about meeting Samwell? Could it be Horace had forgotten to pass on his father's summons? Surely, no Redwine heir would make such a mistake. Watching the familiar shores fade from view, Todd sighed, only to be interrupted by Chimmin, who stood beside him. Isn't that the Redwine twins over there on the docks? Chimmin squinted back at the harbor. Samwell followed his gaze. Yes, it does look like them. I suppose they came to see us off. At this, Todd jerked his head up. Sure enough, Horace and Arbor stood on the dock, waving their arms wildly and shouting something that the distance swallowed. Goodbye. No need to see us off. Samwell called back, waving with exaggerated enthusiasm. Todd opened his mouth, as if to say something, then thought better of it, silently wondering if Horace had, in fact, forgotten his errand. The idea seemed impossible. Wait. Come back. Our father wants to meet you. Our father wants to meet you. On the dock, the twins continued waving and shouting as longshoremen watched them with puzzled amusement. Even after their voices grew hoarse, the ship showed no sign of turning back. Damn it, you stupid oaf! Arbor growled, grabbing his brother by the collar. You overslept. Well, now what do we do? Horace stammered, eyes fixed on the shrinking ship. He was addicted to alcohol last night because of the brandy, so he went back to his room and drank to his heart's content. With no surprise, he drank too much and couldn't get up in time. Images of their father's wrath flashed vividly before him, sending a tremor through his already aching shoulders. Chapter 44, Oldtown. The warm sunlight cast a soft glow over the calm, mirror-like sea, stretching out like a green woolen carpet to the horizon. Whispering Bay was known for its serenity, rarely seeing waves higher than 10 feet. Even the wildest winds softened here, brushing gently over the water like a lover's caress. As the merchant ship entered the bay, Samwell caught sight of Oldtown's most iconic structure far in the distance. The High Tower. This towering stone lighthouse was one of the grandest and most awe-inspiring constructions in all of Westeros, reaching over 800 feet into the sky with a flaming beacon that burned unceasingly at its peak, visible for miles across the sea. For thousands of years, this luminous beacon at the mouth of the Honeywine had guided countless captains safely into port. As the merchant ship drew closer, the imposing outline of the high tower grew clearer. Everyone on deck stared, spellbound by this miraculous structure, holding their breath as if in reverence. Chimon, having never seen anything like it, was visibly trembling, almost ready to drop to his knees in worship. Even Samwell, despite having been accustomed to towering skyscrapers in his previous life, couldn't suppress his amazement. He marveled at how such a lighthouse could have been built with the quasi-medieval technology of the Game of Thrones world. Unless it was magic. The thought crossed Samwell's mind, such a construction seemed impossible without it. As one of the busiest ports in Westeros, the bay was teeming with ships. Their vessel had to queue before docking, giving them ample time to admire the sprawling city before them, glowing warmly in the sunset. Oldtown, with its centuries-old architecture and tranquil charm, looked like a venerable elder who had witnessed the rise and fall of generations with quiet indifference. Beyond the high tower, two other structures defined Oldtown: the Citadel and the Starry September. The Citadel was a haven for scholars and the site of Samwell's youthful dreams. Many learned men had left its walls to advise lords across Westeros, building a legacy of knowledge and wisdom. As for the Starry September, it had been the heart of the faith of the Seven for thousands of years, housing the High Septon himself, until Baelor's Great September in King's Landing had supplanted it just over a century ago. For many faithful, it still remained the holiest place, a step closer to heaven. Of course, when speaking of Oldtown, one couldn't ignore its ruling family, the Hightowers. One of the oldest noble families in Westeros, the Hightowers' lineage could be traced back to the first men, having once reigned as the kings of the High Tower along the banks of the Honeywine. For such an ancient and powerful family, however, the Hightowers were surprisingly and famously unassertive. In fact, to many, they even appeared weak. When the Andals invaded, the Hightowers chose to submit and intermarry. When House Gardner expanded from the Mandor, they bent the knee again, arranging marriages and sending wives away, and when Aegon the Conqueror rode his dragons across Westeros, the Hightowers once again chose submission. Well, they didn't marry into House Targaryen, but only because the Targaryens clung to their own bloodline, marrying brothers to sisters rather than mingling with others. Like they famously said in the movie, keeping the blood of the dragon pure. It was easy to see why such a family, known for submission and compromise, didn't inspire much awe or respect. But Samwell had never underestimated the Hightowers. Underestimating them could come at a steep price, and often in ways one might never notice. Countless maesters had left the Citadel to serve lords across Westeros. While these men claimed to be without names, loyalties, or politics, could anyone truly say the Hightowers had no influence over them? What were those scholars, secretly studying the occult, truly seeking? What schemes were hatched by the Citadel's conclave behind closed doors, hidden from prying eyes? What mysteries lay behind those heavy, ancient doors? To Samwell, the high towers perfectly embodied the principle of overcoming strength with softness. They seldom clashed openly, opting instead to shape the world quietly. Countless ancient houses had faded into history's depths, but the high towers endured. This could not be mere coincidence. When Samwell disembarked from the merchant vessel, he and his entourage were taken onto a ferry bound for Battle Isle, the island at the Honey Wine's mouth where the high tower fortress stood. According to legend, in the distant Age of Dawn, dragons had roosted upon the isle until the first high tower lord drove them out and built the first high tower. Standing at the foot of this human-made marvel, Samwell felt a rare sense of insignificance. This structure looked less like the work of mortals and more like something out of legend. "Welcome, Sir Caesar, to the high tower." A striking, dignified middle-aged man greeted him with a warm smile outside the gates. This was none other than Baelor Hightower, son of Lord Leighton Hightower, ruler of Oldtown. Yet it wasn't Sir Baelor's presence that caught Samwell's attention, it was the young woman standing beside him. It was Lady Marjorie Tyrell. The daughter of the Highgarden Duke wore a green pleated dress, her waist accentuated with golden embroidery. Her soft, brown curls cascaded down from her head, held by a simple headband. When she caught sight of Samwell, her gentle eyes widened with surprise. "Sir Caesar, I almost didn't recognize you." Samwell froze, equally shocked to see the Rose of Highgarden here, beneath the high tower. But he quickly recovered, bowing courteously. "Good day, Sir Baelor, Lady Marjorie. The path of a pioneer is rough, so I've lost some weight." "You've lost more than some weight," Marjorie said with a smile as she looked him up and down. "I've heard you've managed to unite over 10,000 wildlings under your banner. It's truly remarkable. And you've also rid the high towers of a notorious outlaw. My poor cousin can finally rest in peace," Sir Baelor added, acknowledging the wildling head Samwell had sent. Clearly, Lord Brandon of Sunhouse had delivered it as intended. "I'm honoured to be of service to House Hightower," Samwell replied with a slight bow to Sir Baelor, before turning his attention to Marjorie. "Expanding Highgarden's reach is my duty." Marjorie's eyes crinkled with a smile, and adorable dimples appeared on her cheeks. "I'm proud of you, my knight. This month's allowance will be a little more generous." "Thank you for your kindness," Samwell said, his grin broadening. "Your investment will surely see a great return." He then added curiously, "If I may ask, Lady Marjorie, what brings you to Oldtown?" "I came with my mother to visit her family," Marjorie explained. "But I didn't expect to run into you here. What a delightful surprise." Samwell recalled that Marjorie's mother, the Lady of Highgarden, was indeed the daughter of Lord Leighton Hightower. "Enough standing around out here. Come inside." Sir Baelor gestured to the entrance. Nodding, Samwell accepted a servant's offering of bread and salt, took a bite, and then stepped inside the gates of the high tower. Chapter 45, The Banquet. As Samwell entered the high tower, he couldn't help but let his eyes wander, taking in every detail of the massive structure around him. The thick walls, formed of dark stone, gave the space a sense of weight and age, each tiny crack seemingly holding a story long forgotten. Noticing Samwell's curiosity, Baelor laughed. "Everyone's fascinated the first time they step in here. But if you stay for decades, you'll feel nothing but confined and weary. If I had an older brother, I would have been free to roam wherever I wanted long ago." Samwell traced a hand along the smooth, dark wall and asked, "Was this really built over 10,000 years ago?" Baelor chuckled. "Not quite. The High Tower family did settle here in the Dawn Age, but our first fortress was a wooden tower, only 50 feet high. Later, we built a series of taller towers, and this current one, well, it's the fifth. Built by Bran the Builder." Samwell recalled his knowledge of Westeros lore. "Yes." Baelor nodded, a distant look in his eyes. "They say he also built the wall. I'd love to see it someday." "And Storm's End," another voice chimed in from behind them. Samwell turned and saw a strikingly handsome youth descending the stairs. It was rare for Samwell to think of a man as pretty, but there was no other word that fit. With flowing brown curls, golden eyes, and exquisitely fine features, he could captivate any woman and perhaps even a few men. As the young man noticed their gaze, he gave a slight smile and continued, "Lord Renly told me that Storm's End was also Bran the Builder's work. It stands untouched by even the fiercest storm. Loras, come here." Marjorie called, motioning to the young man on the stairs. "This is the knight I told you about, Samwell Caesar." Loras came forward, nodding politely. I am Loras Tyrell, third son of the Duke of Highgarden. Pleased to meet you, Sir Caesar. The honor is mine, Sir Loras. Samwell nodded in return, realizing he was meeting the famed Knight of Flowers. His reputation preceded him. Samwell vaguely recalled that Loras was supposed to be serving as a squire to Lord Renly Baratheon at Storm's End. His surprise must have been apparent because Loras added, Lord Renly is here as well. He's upstairs talking with Lord Hightower and my mother. Renly's here, too? Samwell wondered. House Hightower and House Baratheon weren't exactly close. It seemed that Marjorie and her mother's visit to Oldtown had more behind it than just family business. As Samwell's mind drifted, Loras remarked, You're nothing like I'd imagined, Sir Caesar. They say you've carved out a territory in the Red Mountains and won the loyalty of thousands of wildlings. Yes, thanks to the Seven's blessing. The Seven only bless brave, devout knights, Loras said with a smile. I'd heard rumors about you, but now I see they were nasty lies. No wonder Lord Renly always says to trust one's eyes, not one's ears. Thank you for the kind words. Samwell returned the compliment smoothly, adding, and I've heard much of your skill, Sir Loras, particularly with the lance. Everything I know about justing I learned from Lord Renly. He's the finest knight I know, and a wise lord too. I've never encountered wildlings myself, though. Could you tell me more about them, Sir Caesar? What kind of weapons do they use? Of course. Their weapons are crude. As he spoke, Samwell chuckled to himself. Loras's open admiration for Renly was beyond apparent. With every other sentence mentioning Lord Renly, it was no surprise that rumors about the two of them had circulated across noble circles. They continued chatting amicably as they walked, and when they reached a certain floor, Baylor stopped and gestured toward a door. This is your room, Sir Caesar. Your attendants are next door. Feel free to rest. The banquet will begin at 6, and someone will come fetch you. Thank you, Sir Baylor. I'll see you all later. Until then, Loras and Marjorie replied. Inside his room, Samwell took a bath, then lay down for a nap. It wasn't until a servant knocked on his door that he finally got up and changed for the banquet. This time, Samwell waited for Todd Flowers and Chimon to get ready so they could head to the hall together. After his previous experience at Sunhouse, Samwell wasn't about to blindly follow any servant to dinner, no matter how inviting the scenario. One could never be too cautious. When the three of them entered the banquet hall, they were greeted by polished purple heartwood floors so fine they shone like glass. The wood was tight-grained, lustrous, and often reserved for high-end furniture. Here, it was used as flooring. 7 alabaster columns carved with intricate designs rose to support the hall's vaulted ceiling, while more than a dozen armored guards stood at attention around the hall, tall and imposing with long spears in hand. Graceful maids moved lightly through the room, placing exquisite dishes onto a long banquet table. The feast was set up as a buffet, though few guests lingered over the dishes, taking only small samples of each. To do otherwise would have been a breach of decorum. The guests naturally separated into groups. To the left sat the noble women and young ladies in their finest dresses, their laughter ringing out like bells. To the right, groups of gentlemen engaged in quiet, polite conversation. The brightly lit hall, the elegant decor, the courteous servers, the graceful maidens, and the endless array of delicacies all came together to paint a picture of a grand noble banquet. Though Todd was a bastard, he had grown up around the nobility, and after his years serving in Highgarden, he was not too unsettled by the grand setting. He merely adjusted his collar once or twice. Chimon, however, was utterly lost, his movements stiff and awkward. Samwell, paying little mind to his attendants, entered the hall with a confident, poised smile, following a young maid who led them in with a deep bow. Chapter 46, Collaboration. Upon entering the banquet hall, Samwell immediately noticed Lady Marjorie Tyrell. Tonight, the Rose of Highgarden wore a pink satin halter gown, the backless and cinched design elegantly accentuating her graceful figure. Her deep brown eyes sparkled like rare jewels, and her soft red lips curved into a charming smile. Marjorie's noble bearing and stunning beauty ensured that, wherever she went, she was the undeniable center of attention. Samwell, of course, didn't rush over to her. Here at the Hightower, he knew he needed to first pay his respects to the host. Lord Leighton was easy to find. The gentlemen gathered to the right side of the hall were subtly centered around 4 figures: Sir Baylor Hightower, who had welcomed Samwell earlier, the flamboyantly dressed Knight of Flowers Sir Loras Tyrell, a tall, handsome young man bearing the crowned stag of House Baratheon. This must be Renly Baratheon, the Lord of Storm's End and younger brother of the king. Finally, the white-haired elder engaged in friendly conversation with Lord Renly had to be the Lord of the Hightower, Leyton Hightower. Noticing Samwell's approach, Sir Baelor leaned over to whisper something to his father, and soon Lord Leyton's gaze shifted to Samwell. Before Samwell could speak, Lord Leyton smiled warmly and said, "Sir Caesar, I received your gift. I liked it very much." "The honor is mine, my lord," Samwell said, bowing deeply. Lord Renly then looked at Samwell with a hint of curiosity. "Forgive my intrusion, but is Caesar an old house of the Reach? I don't recall hearing the name before." Sir Loras chimed in, "Lord Renly, Sir Caesar here is a pioneering knight of House Tyrell. He is the eldest son of Lord Randall Tarley, named Samwell. Recently, he's established a new fiefdom in the Red Mountains and adopted Caesar as his new house name." Lord Renly looked surprised, wondering why the heir of House Tarley would choose the harsh lands of the Red Mountains over his own inheritance at Horn Hill. Yet, showing good manners, he merely smiled and said, "Ah, so a knight from the hunter's line. No wonder you succeeded in carving out a territory in those wild mountains. A promising young hero." "You flatter me, my lord," Samwell replied with a gracious smile. "The castle isn't built yet, so I wouldn't say I've truly settled the land." "I'm sure you'll have your castle completed soon enough," Renly encouraged. Then, seeing that Samwell clearly had business with Lord Leyton, he added, "I'll fetch some food." "Please, carry on." "I'll join you," said Loras, trailing after him eagerly. Now alone with Lord Leyton and his son, Samwell got straight to the point. "Lord Hightower, I came to Oldtown with 3 requests I hope you might assist me with." "Do tell," Leyton said, still smiling in his relaxed manner. "First, my territory has a newly discovered silver mine. I've sent word to King's Landing to request official authorization. However, I still need a maester skilled in mining, smelting, and coinage. Might you be able to recommend someone?" Leyton folded his hands and replied, "It's tradition for the Citadel to assign each noble with a maester as an advisor. But, until your castle is fully built and you're recognized as an official lord by the Warden of the South, I'm afraid the Citadel won't appoint one to you. That's precisely why I sought your help, hoping perhaps you could influence the Citadel to make an exception and assign someone early. If that's not feasible, then perhaps just a maester willing to teach me the methods of silver mining and refining. The Citadel's rules are quite rigid, I'm afraid," Leyton said slowly, "and even I cannot change them." Samwell barely stopped himself from rolling his eyes considering the Hightowers founded and funded the Citadel. It was hard to believe they lacked influence. But before he could speak further, Lord Leyton added, "However, I could ask my daughter, Malara, to teach you the processes for mining and refining silver." "Malara Hightower? The Mad Maid?" Samwell swallowed his earlier grumbling, offering a sincere thank you, "My lord. Is Lady Malara here tonight? I'd like to extend my gratitude personally." "She's not," Baelor said with a rueful smile. "My sister has no interest in noble gatherings. I'll take you to see her in the morning." True to her reputation, thought Samwell. "Thank you, I'd appreciate that." Moving on, Samwell continued, "My second matter concerns supplies. As you know, the Red Mountains are barren, unsuitable for farming. I'll need a steady source of grain and other provisions, and I wondered if House Hightower might be willing to serve as my supplier." Although Samwell had arranged a supply line with House Q, he wasn't comfortable depending entirely on a single house for his fief's resources. Diversifying his suppliers was only prudent. "That won't be a problem," Leyton replied immediately. Profitable trade arrangements were very much House Hightower's style. "You can settle the details with Baelor." Baelor inclined his head with a polite smile. "Indeed, Sir Caesar. I handle our house's trade affairs." "Very well." Samwell nodded at Baelor, then added, "The third matter involves a new wine I've crafted in my lands. I'm hoping to collaborate with you to distribute it." "A new wine?" Leyton's nose twitched, curiosity piqued. "May I try it?" Samwell chuckled internally. "So he's a wine lover, is he?" Taking an oak cask from Todd Flowers, Samwell explained, "This wine was made with wild grapes from the Red Mountains. I think you'll enjoy it." He poured a cup from the cask, but before he could warn Leyton about the strength of the brandy, the Lord tipped the entire glass back in one gulp. "Splendid!" Leyton breathed out, his forehead now dotted with beads of sweat and his nose a deeper shade of red. Baylor, intrigued, said, "Could I have a taste as well?" "Of course." At that moment Renly and Loras returned, and seeing the new drink being sampled, they also requested a cup. Westerosi nobles, by and large, had a penchant for drink whether for health or sociability. In all, the debut of brandy was a hit beyond Samwell's hopes. The sweetness of the grapes and the oak's aroma merged beautifully, Leighton praised, swaying slightly. "Sir Caesar, you're truly gifted in the art of winemaking. Does this have a name?" "Brandy," Samwell said. "Though, unfortunately, it hasn't been aged long enough for the full flavor to develop." "Lord Hightower, would House Hightower be interested in helping distribute this brandy?" "Absolutely." Chapter 47, The First Dance. To everyone's surprise, the highlight of the banquet wasn't the radiant Lady Marjorie or the distinguished Lord Renly, but rather a new drink, brandy. Nearly every guest who tasted the brandy had nothing but praise for it, but since production hadn't yet begun on a large scale, Samwell had only brought a limited supply. The first round barely made it through before the cask was empty. The scarcity drove up demand, leaving the guests even more eager to acquire some. Soon, a circle of nobles gathered around Samwell, eager to discuss purchasing arrangements for the brandy. Despite the fervor, Samwell remained composed, explaining that he had already arranged an exclusive sales agreement with House Hightower and that they would need to speak with Sir Baylor for any orders. Though direct sales could have meant higher profits, Samwell was well aware that he neither had the resources to organize trade routes nor the time. Moreover, the allure of brandy's profits would undoubtedly attract envious eyes, and he knew he needed powerful allies to protect and support his venture. Right now, House Hightower was precisely the ally he needed. Watching as Lord Leighton and Sir Baylor were swiftly encircled by interested nobles, Samwell sipped his drink, his smile broad. Then, his stomach rumbled a sharp reminder that he had yet to eat. Handing his empty glass to a servant, he retrieved a silver plate and headed for the long banquet tables at the front of the hall. His eyes quickly scanned over the feast until he spotted a dish he'd been hoping for: gold-tail shrimp. Samwell's face lit up. Even though the shrimp's effects on his strength had diminished as he consumed more, every bit helped. And this was a self-serve banquet, so he could eat as much as he liked on House Hightower's coin. He stationed himself beside the platter, happily stacking shrimp onto his plate, eating without concern for the curious stares from other guests. Reputation, after all, was a fluid thing. Once, he was seen as the shame of House Tarly. But after he'd secured a foothold in the Red Mountains, he became the enterprising and promising Sir Samwell Caesar. And if one day he managed to ascend the Iron Throne, he'd be remembered as King Caesar. By then, any awkward moments, struggles, or failures would dissolve in the legend of his achievements. Todd Flowers, witnessing his lord's unabashed feasting, quietly withdrew to a corner of the hall, avoiding attention. Chimon, meanwhile, eagerly followed Samwell's lead, balancing a full plate as he sampled everything he could. The young wildling had never seen such a spread and certainly wasn't going to waste the opportunity. As the eccentric pair indulged, a soft melody began to fill the air, signaling the start of the evening's dancing. Samwell remained rooted in place. Dancing was not among his talents. Although his predecessor had learned the basics in his youth, those skills were long forgotten. As for Chimon, dancing was even more of a stretch. He had begun reaching for the shrimp platter himself, only to be met with Samwell's fierce "don't even think about it" glare. Already, many nobles had found partners and stepped onto the floor, where they moved gracefully in tune with the music. Most eyes turned to Lord Renly, who naturally walked toward the most captivating woman in the hall, Marjorie Tyrell, clearly intending to ask the Rose of Highgarden for the first dance. But just as he reached her, a young lady in a purple evening gown unexpectedly intercepted him. With little choice, Lord Renly took her hand and escorted her to the dance floor. Samwell raised an eyebrow at this mystery woman bold enough to steal the Highgarden Rose's partner, until he noticed Sir Baylor's embarrassed expression. It was his daughter, the eldest granddaughter of Lord Leighton Hightower, no less. With such standing, she could certainly rival Lady Marjorie for the evening's first dance, especially here in the Hightower. With Renly's attention diverted, few men in the hall held sufficient rank to step forward and ask Marjorie for the first dance. Normally, her brother Loras might have come to her aid, but he was already engaged. So, the hall's brightest gem now found herself without a partner as the music played on. Samwell noticed several young noblemen eyeing her, each hesitating, afraid of the potential embarrassment of being turned down. He scoffed and muttered under his breath, "Cowards! Then, setting his plate down, he walked over to Marjorie with purpose. As House Tyrell's knight, he felt it was his duty to save Lady Marjorie from any awkwardness. Even if he wasn't a skilled dancer. Yes, it was purely out of loyalty. Lady Marjorie, may I have the honor of this first dance? Seeing him, Marjorie seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. She'd been left waiting long enough, and any longer might have appeared undignified. Of course, my knight. She smiled warmly, placing her delicate, porcelain hand in his, allowing him to lead her to the center of the dance floor. As they assumed their positions, Samwell leaned closer, whispering, "A little secret, I'm not exactly a seasoned dancer." Marjorie's eyes widened slightly, but she managed a small, amused sigh. "Well, I'll guide you then." She began coaching him, showing him the steps, how to keep time, and how to carry himself gracefully, and most importantly, how not to step on her toes. At first, their movements were clumsy. But as fragments of Samwell's childhood lessons returned, his steps grew steadier. He wasn't exactly graceful, but he was no longer stomping on Marjorie's feet either. Her scarlet heels, however, bore a few black marks. "Not bad, right?" he asked, smiling as he twirled her around the dance floor. "Not bad," Marjorie replied, puffing her cheeks in mock annoyance. "Although if you'd applied the same enthusiasm you showed for those shrimp to learning these steps, you'd be quite the dancer by now." Samwell laughed, saying nothing in reply, and spun her in a daring turn that drew a surprised gasp from her. As she steadied herself, Marjorie shot him a playful glare, though it held no real malice. They found their rhythm as they danced, and Marjorie began to reveal her true elegance. Her movements were fluid and graceful, her beauty radiant, drawing all eyes in the hall. Even with a slightly uncoordinated partner, she reclaimed her place as the center of attention. Watching from the sidelines, those same hesitant young nobles looked on with regret, realizing what they'd missed. As Samwell guided Marjorie through another turn, she whispered, "Samwell, you know House Tyrell can assist with distributing your brandy." Samwell smiled faintly. "Sorry, Lady Marjorie, I didn't quite catch that." Rolling her eyes, she repeated her words. "My apologies," he said, his voice laced with polite regret. "I've already signed an exclusive distribution contract with House Hightower." Of course, this was a fabrication. Samwell had made no such commitment, and he had no intention of creating a monopoly. However, in negotiations, sometimes one had to create leverage where none existed. Marjorie's elegant brows drew together in a slight frown. Samwell leaned in, murmuring, "But for House Tyrell's sake, I could try renegotiating with Lord Leighton, though." "Though what?" she asked. Chapter 48, Convincing. "But I worry that Lord Leighton may not be willing to amend the agreement." "Yes, that's possible." Marjorie also suspected that House Hightower might be reluctant to share the profits, and so she offered, "Perhaps I could ask my mother to speak to Lord Leighton on this matter." "That might not be wise." Samwell quickly intervened. "If word got out, people might say House Tyrell was vying with its own bannerman for profit." "Very well," Marjorie sighed, abandoning the idea. "How confident are you that you can persuade Lord Leighton to renegotiate?" "Well," Samwell put on a pained expression, "it depends on how much of the profits I'm willing to give up to the Hightowers. I imagine Lord Leighton will ask for a larger share." Feeling somewhat guilty, Marjorie replied, "Thank you, Samwell. I'll explain the situation to my father and ask him to ensure you receive a larger share to offset any losses." "You're truly a kind soul, my lady," Samwell said, barely restraining a smile. "Actually, what I would prefer even more than a share of the profits is compensation in another form." "Another form?" "Yes. As you know, most of my current subjects are wildlings, and I have too few reachmen in my lands. This lack of balance poses a latent danger that could erupt at any moment. And as a reach noble, I naturally feel more trust in reachmen. Therefore, I would like permission from the Duke to gather the dispossessed and encourage them to settle in Eagle's Nest." "This?" Marjorie hesitated, well aware of how valuable population was for any noble. No wise ruler would allow their people to leave en masse, even those without land. Samwell's earlier recruitment of dock labourers had already skirted the rules, and House Tyrell had only overlooked it because the numbers were small. But now he was talking about gathering far more people. Uncertain of the total number of dispossessed in the Reach, Marjorie nonetheless knew it wasn't insignificant. Allowing Samwell to take so many would be hard to justify. Seeing her hesitation, Samwell urged further, Lady Marjorie, those landless wanderers don't contribute taxes to House Tyrell, they're simply a drain on resources. The more of them that linger, the more they tarnish the beauty of Highgarden. Please, let me help clean this blemish for you. I'll speak to my father about it, Marjorie said, clearly torn, but added quickly, rest assured, if he doesn't agree to allow resettlement, we'll arrange other ways to compensate you. But I only want people. Samwell thought. At present, he commanded only a few hundred reachmen, a number far too small compared to his thousands of wildling subjects. And as his reach extended further into the Red Mountains, he was sure to recruit even more wildlings, but he had no real way to balance this with loyal reachmen. While Samwell didn't dislike the wildlings, he recognized that an imbalance of this magnitude posed a real threat. The best way forward was to bring enough reachmen into his lands to offset the numbers, not necessarily to outnumber the wildlings, but at least to hold enough influence to keep them in check. And with enough reachmen, he could encourage intermarriage to promote unity. Right now, though, he barely had enough reachmen to go around among the wildling women. Gathering himself, Samwell tried again, saying, Lady Marjorie, you're different from most noble women. You have a compassionate heart. I remember hearing beggars speak of the food you've shared, bakers say you purchased their fresh pies, and farmers mention how kindly you spoke to them. Though you're of high birth, you never put on airs. I'm sure you understand the hardship of those who have lost their land. I give you my word, my lady. Once those poor souls become my subjects, they will want for nothing as long as they're willing to work. May the seven bear witness to my promise. Hearing this, Marjorie finally met Samwell's gaze. He immediately responded with his most sincere, confident look, returning her gaze with unwavering honesty. After a long pause, the beautiful young woman gave a solemn nod, saying, Very well. I'll do my best to convince my father to allow it. That's the promise I needed. Samwell thought with glee. If he weren't afraid of getting pummeled, he might have pulled Marjorie in for a hug. With Marjorie's support, he was confident the plan would succeed. Lord Mace Tyrell was not known for his independent thinking and would hardly deny his cherished daughter's wishes over a few insignificant wanderers. Thank you for your help, Lady Marjorie. Your kindness is sure to be rewarded. Sir Samwell, Marjorie's tone grew serious. I hope you'll remember this promise. Perhaps one day I'll visit your lands myself, and if I find those people's lives are no better, then you may tell all that Samwell Caesar is a man who breaks his oaths, Samwell replied with equal gravity. Good. Marjorie's smile returned, bright and sweet. I trust you won't disappoint me, my knight. Looking into her bright, earnest eyes, Samwell felt a pang of guilt. He'd gone to great lengths to manipulate her compassion. Was this fair? Then, reassuring himself, he remembered that he fully intended to improve those people's lives. With brandy and silver, Eagle's Nest would prosper. So really, it wasn't deception, it was strategy. Of course, manipulating and calculating. Well, those were harder to justify. But for any great achievement, there were bound to be sacrifices, weren't there? He could always find a way to repay her kindness later. His thoughts drifted back to Marjorie's tragic fate. Her family's ambitions ultimately led her to marry 3 kings, each as short-lived as the last. No, Samwell resolved he couldn't let such a sweet and noble woman suffer that fate. And the best way to shield her from it? To marry her himself. It was purely out of concern, of course. Certainly not because of her beauty or her connections. And not because of the wealth and power of the Reach. Just a chivalrous sense of duty to save her from future heartbreak. Though he knew his current status made this an impossible dream, he still had time. Marjorie's first marriage was still a few years off during the chaos of the War of the 5 Kings. Samwell figured he had a little over 2.5 years. Yes, it sounded impossible to go from a frontier lord to a man worthy of marrying a duke's daughter in 2 years. But if he couldn't aim for that, he might as well forget about his dreams of the Iron Throne. With this in mind, he gave in to the thrill of the dance, spinning Marjorie with renewed confidence. As the notes of a final, lingering chord hung in the air, the dance came to a close. Samwell stopped, letting Marjorie's hand rest in his as he guided her off the floor. Thank you, Sir Caesar. The pleasure was mine, Lady Marjorie. As he released her hand, he noticed Lord Renly approaching them. After a courteous nod to Samwell, Renly graciously asked Marjorie for the next dance. Of course, Marjorie accepted. Watching them make their way to the floor, Samwell prepared to return to his precious gold-tail shrimp, but froze when he overheard Renly say, "Lady Marjorie, your beauty outshines the stars tonight. I've brought a painter with me. May I have him create a portrait of you?" Samwell's steps faltered. If any other man said this, it would be an unmistakable gesture of courtship. But Lord Renly? He probably wanted to paint Marjorie's brother Loras just as much, if not more. As Samwell watched them walk off together, a tiny detail from the original story resurfaced in his mind. At some point in the near future, Renly would show a portrait of Marjorie to Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell. A chill ran down Samwell's spine. Suddenly, he realized that Renly's unexpected presence at the High Tower, and Marjorie's coincidental visit with her mother, were no accidents. There was the unmistakable scent of conspiracy in the air. Chapter 49, Puppeteer. The soothing notes of a harp filled the air. In the center of the hall, elegantly dressed men and women whirled gracefully, showcasing their most refined dance steps. Meanwhile, Samwell had returned to his dining spot, nibbling on his beloved gold-tail shrimp while watching Lord Renly and Lady Marjorie, who looked like a golden couple as they spun across the dance floor. A mysterious smile played across his lips. He recalled the moment in the original story where Renly showed Eddard Stark a portrait of Marjorie, asking him if she resembled his late sister, Lyanna Stark. Lyanna, Robert Baratheon's first love and a spark that ignited an entire war. Years ago, Lyanna was betrothed to Robert, but she was abducted by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. Driven by fury, Robert had rebelled against the throne, inciting the infamous rebellion. Though Robert eventually defeated Rhaegar and claimed the Iron Throne, Lyanna had perished during the conflict, leaving Robert with a wound that never healed. By asking Ned if Marjorie resembled Lyanna, Renly was clearly hinting at presenting her to King Robert as a replacement queen, perhaps to supplant Queen Cersei Lannister. However, as the story later revealed, this plan did not come to fruition. As careless as Robert could be on the throne, neglecting governance for indulgence in drinking and hunting, he was no fool. He wasn't about to dethrone Cersei, especially when she had the backing of the immensely wealthy and powerful House Lannister, led by her father, Tywin. Removing her from the throne would require undeniable proof of her betrayal, namely, that her 3 children were not Robert's but were actually fathered by her twin brother, Jaime. But that secret would be difficult to prove. Even though some already suspected or knew of it, no one held concrete evidence. Without a blatant scandal like catching Cersei and Jaime in the act, conjecture alone wouldn't suffice. As for the fact that all 3 of Robert's children bore Lannister's golden hair instead of Baratheon's dark locks, this was far from conclusive. It was normal enough for children to inherit their mother's traits. In fact, many people thought it fitting for the king's children to have golden hair, considering how House Lannister's iconic gold hair had remained a feature for 6 millennia, practically a genetic miracle. With House Baratheon only around for a few centuries, it seemed almost inevitable that the lion's gold would overpower the stag's black. So it wasn't surprising that Robert never questioned the color of his children's hair. Lacking proof, Lord Renly had apparently opted for this roundabout method to push for Cersei's removal. Of course, the truth of her children's parentage would only come to light later, once Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King, uncovered clues in the lineages and histories of the great houses of the 7 kingdoms, sparking a chain of events orchestrated by a master manipulator and setting off the Game of Thrones. But for now, Samwell simply observed Renly on the dance floor, trying to decode his motives. It seemed clear from Renly's later actions during the War of the 5 Kings that he harbored ambitions for the Iron Throne. Yet as the king's younger brother, Renly's place in the line of succession was behind Cersei's 3 children and his elder brother Stannis. Renly's attempts to have his brother dethrone Cersei now looked like a ploy to disinherit her children. That would mean that only Stannis stood between Renly and the throne. Renly knew well enough that Robert had never been fond of Stannis. Despite Stannis's valiant defense of Storm's End during Robert's rebellion, Robert had appointed his much younger brother, Renly, as Lord of Storm's End, while sending Stannis to rule over Dragonstone. Although Dragonstone traditionally served as a symbolic holding for the throne's heir, that had been a Targaryen practice, with little relevance in the Baratheon dynasty. Storm's End, the true Baratheon seat, had gone to Renly instead. So in Renly's mind, if he could just see Cersei's children stripped of their legitimacy, he would become first in line for the Iron Throne, with Robert's approval. Samwell set down his plate and considered another angle. What role did the Tyrells play in this scheme? An amused smile tugged at his lips. Back when he'd first read the books, he'd noticed that many apparent main characters often died abruptly, as if the author was eager to illustrate the brutal reality of political scheming. Yet when he'd thought more carefully about it, he'd realized that there was always a reason behind each death, as if everything had been preordained. In the grand scheme, these main characters were mere pawns to the true players, manipulated into action by hidden forces. The real players were never the ones at the center of attention, but lurked in the background, unseen. Take Renly, for example, handsome, charismatic, and seemingly in control. But he was only another puppet, dancing to strings pulled by one of the true masterminds of this game, the Queen of Thorns, Lady Olenna Tyrell. How else could Renly have discovered that Margaery bore a resemblance to Robert's lost love? Samwell surmised that it was likely her brother Loras who had unintentionally shared that information with Renly in a casual moment. It was this knowledge that had driven Renly to Highgarden, or rather, to Oldtown. The shrewd Lady Olenna would never have let Renly visit Highgarden directly, that would have made House Tyrell's involvement too obvious. Instead, by arranging a coincidental encounter under the guise of a family visit to Oldtown, she kept their involvement discreet. If the plot succeeded, House Tyrell could claim innocence, leaving Renly to face the fury of the Lannisters alone. And if it failed, then House Tyrell would have risked nothing. All they'd sacrificed was an offhand comment by Loras and a single portrait of Margaery, nothing too costly, while Renly, with his bright, bold ambitions, would do all the legwork, assuming all the risk. Samwell couldn't help but admire the subtlety of the plan, a masterstroke of Olenna's characteristic style. If Renly's gambit succeeded, Olenna would likely dispose of him without hesitation, casting him aside to appease House Lannister or perhaps even to clear the way for her grandchildren. Poor Renly, unaware he was being used to serve House Tyrell's ambitions. It reminded Samwell of the Smith's scathing assessment of the Baratheon brothers: Robert was true steel, unbreakable in the flames, Stannis was raw iron, too rigid and brittle, and Renly was polished brass, beautiful but hollow. The dance came to an end, and the couples gradually dispersed. Renly, meanwhile, escorted Margaery into a side chamber. Watching as his future wife left in Renly's company, Samwell felt no worry. He knew that Renly's plan wouldn't work. Were it anyone else, he might worry about what might happen behind closed doors, but with Renly? This man was, well, a man's man. Samwell chuckled, then reached for his beloved gold-tail shrimp, only to realize that the platter was empty. Unbelievable, they'd eaten it all. Should he request more from Lord Leighton? Or would that be excessive? The all-knowing Sir Caesar found himself in a delightful quandary. Chapter 50, Lighting the Way. Even the grandest banquet must eventually draw to a close. Late into the night, Sir Baelor saw off the last guest before finally heading to his father's room, feeling worn out. Father. Lord Leighton Hightower stood by the window, gazing out over the sea, which reflected the starry sky and the flames from the high tower. His usual friendly, welcoming demeanor was gone, replaced by a pensive, almost somber expression. Baelor wasn't surprised by his father's change. From a young age, he had understood that his father wore a mask of cheer for strangers. Over time, Baelor had even learned to wear a similar mask, though he had never quite mastered the art, often appearing awkward or insincere. The nickname Baelor the Smiling had become more mockery than admiration. What is it? Lord Leighton finally returned to his desk, sitting down with a casual tone. Baelor poured wine for his father and himself. Just now, Jenny came to see me. Lord Leighton scoffed before Baelor could finish. She wants to marry Renly. Baelor nodded, unsurprised that his father had guessed it. After all, Jenny's bold move at the banquet, stepping in to take the first dance with Renly instead of Lady Margaery, had shown her interest plainly. No. Lord Leighton's reply was firm and immediate. Father, are you worried that Lord Renly might refuse her? House Hightower is a well-respected family in Westeros. Surely, it's worth gauging his interest. Even if Renly wants to marry her, I won't allow it. Baelor was momentarily taken aback. Why? After a sip of wine, Lord Leighton asked, do you truly believe Renly came to Oldtown simply to see the High Tower? Baelor fell silent, considering his father's question. Lord Leighton continued, hinting, and your sister's sudden urge to visit us at the same time. You think it wasn't a coincidence that Margaery and Renly were both here? Leighton poured himself another glass, speaking quietly, I've never believed in coincidences. Baelor's mind churned, and finally, he remembered something from the banquet. Father, during the banquet, Renly wanted to paint a portrait of Margaery. Do you think he intends to propose to House Tyrell? Leighton scoffed, then why wouldn't he go directly to Highgarden? Baelor went silent, his father's disapproval deepening as he continued, no matter what they're plotting, we're staying out of it. Tell Jenny I'll find her a suitable husband, but Renly is out of the question. Baylor took a deep drink, feeling reluctant to let go of what he saw as a promising opportunity. Father, perhaps you're overthinking it. Renly Baratheon is an exceptional young lord. He could be valuable as an ally. What is our house's motto? Lord Leighton asked suddenly. The abrupt question threw Baylor off. What? Lord Leighton patiently repeated, what are the words of House Hightower? After a pause, Baylor responded, we light the way. Yes, Lord Leighton replied, we light the way, but that doesn't mean we lead it. Hey! Baylor was baffled. Sighing, Lord Leighton explained, we light the way so others may tread it first. We remain behind, safely observing. The road ahead may be glorious, but it's also perilous. For those of us holding the light, there is safety in the shadows. I saw Renly's ambition the first time I met him. He's a man who will never settle for less than the front lines. We must keep our distance from him, lest his blood splatter on us someday. Baylor was silent, stunned as he slowly processed his father's words. He felt as if he were uncovering, for the first time, the true meaning of their house motto. But then, remembering House Hightower's extensive history, Baylor couldn't help but admit the grim wisdom in his father's words. Leighton gave him time to process this Hightower wisdom. When Baylor finally spoke, his tone was thoughtful, almost somber, as he recalled a memory. Years ago, you refused to let me wed Princess Elia of Dorne. Was that for the same reason? Indeed. Leighton nodded. And considering her fate, aren't you glad I did? Baylor bristled. But if she had married me, she wouldn't have perished in King's Landing. You still don't understand. Lord Leighton's tone grew weary. Some fates are etched in the stones of destiny by the gods themselves. They're inevitable, unavoidable. Our only defense as mere mortals is to listen carefully for the faintest of whispers, hinting at those unfortunate souls marked by fate, and to steer clear of them. Of course, since no one can truly foresee all things, the safest choice is to avoid anyone who looks eager to lead. Let them walk the path we light while we remain hidden in the shadows. Baylor sighed, and as he considered his father's logic, he felt as though many past events suddenly made sense. Years ago, Lord Tywin offered his second son as a match, but you refused him. Was it for the same reason? Leighton nodded. Yes. And yet my sister Ellery was wed to Lord Mace Tyrell. Leighton chuckled, disdain plain in his voice. Do you think the fat lord has what it takes to lead? Baylor coughed to cover his discomfort, but he didn't yield. But Tywin's second son is merely a dwarf. Surely Lord Mace is a better match. Leighton shook his head with a dry smile. What of it? Paramore Hightower, founder of the Citadel, was a crippled hunchback. Changing the world isn't solely the privilege of the strong, a keen mind can be just as powerful. And Tywin's dwarf son? Of all his children, he's the only one who truly carries the lion's spirit. Remember, some men are much bigger than they appear. Rather than argue further, Baylor set his cup down and bid his father good night. Just as he reached the door, Leighton's voice stopped him once more. One more thing, Baylor. Keep a professional distance from Samwell Caesar. Trading is fine, but don't get too close. Baylor blinked, surprised. Do you really think Samwell Caesar is a potential leader? Let me ask you this, if I gave you 200 soldiers in half a year, could you carve out a territory in the Red Mountains and make thousands of wildlings submit to you? Baylor had no response. After a moment, he could only sigh and leave. Just as he reached the door, he turned back, eyes shadowed by frustration. Father, if we keep to the shadows, don't you worry that someday we'll be forgotten? Lord Leighton's expression was unreadable as he replied, do you remember your Uncle Gerald? He was a Hightower who refused to be forgotten, so he went to King's Landing, where he became the Lord Commander of the King's Guard. One of the Seven Kingdoms' greatest knights, the famed White Bull Gerald Hightower. A note of bitterness crept into his tone as he added, he was known far and wide. I would never have imagined a Hightower's name to spread so boldly across the Seven Kingdoms. And yet where did he die? Lord Leighton sank back into his chair, his face slipping into shadow, his voice weary and distant. To be forgotten is better than to be destroyed. Chapter 51, The Citadel. The renowned Citadel, a sprawling complex on the banks of the Honey Wine, lacks the grandeur of the Hightower or the holy splendor of the starry September, yet it is perhaps the most intellectually rich site in all of Westeros. Facing Whispering Sound, the citadel's grand entrance is flanked by 2 towering green sphinxes, each with the body of a lion, eagle wings, a serpent's tail, and the visage of a man and a woman. Their eyes remain closed, as if forever contemplating some ancient, unsolvable mystery. Samwell followed Sir Baelor Hightower through the gates. Inside, he found a lively marketplace filled with stalls selling books, maps, and rare scrolls. Many commoners lined up nearby, awaiting the assistance of acolytes to draft letters or manage other affairs that required literacy. As they moved further into the citadel, Samwell noticed a small island within the courtyard, shaded by an enormous weirwood tree. Its branches spanned nearly the entire island, and countless ravens roosted among them. The sight was strangely reverent, like a scene from a deeply religious painting. Crossing a weathered wooden bridge, the two arrived at a vine-covered tower blanketed in moss. Baelor stopped. "My sister Malara is inside, on the 4th floor, left at the top of the stairs. I have other matters to attend to, so I'll leave you to meet her on your own." Samwell nodded and watched as Baelor departed. Then, he ascended the narrow, winding staircase alone. At the 4th floor, he stopped before a door, knocked softly, and waited. A low female voice answered, "Come in." He entered and was immediately struck by an unsettling blend of scents: rotting flesh, mingled with sharp antiseptic. The room was dim, with only a single, heavily draped window allowing in faint light. Once his eyes adjusted, Samwell glanced around and barely contained his shock. The shelves were filled with lifelike specimens: lizards, giant snakes, bears, leopards, and other creatures whose names he didn't even know. Each was preserved in detailed, eerie stillness, a silent testimony to a deep fascination with life and death. It dawned on him why Baelor had avoided entering the room. He hadn't wanted to be alone here. "Ah, Lady Malara, I am." "I know who you are," Malara interrupted, her voice quick and impatient. "A servant told me you'd be coming when I got up this morning." Her hands were busy with a small, sharp knife, skillfully dissecting the abdomen of a spider the size of her hand, greenish fluid pooling across her fingertips in a sight both grotesque and captivating. Samwell steadied himself, managing a polite smile. "In that case, might I ask you for information on silver mining?" "It's there," she interrupted again, jerking her chin towards a table stacked with books. "The one with the white cover. Everything you need is inside. If you have questions, come back." He picked up the book and flipped through it, confirming that it indeed covered mining and refining techniques. "Thank you, Lady Malara. If I have any questions, I will." "Good." She was already returning to her work, clearly eager for him to leave. "Can I get a single word out without being cut off?" he thought wryly as he made a hasty exit, stepping back into the sunlight with a sigh of relief. The tales of Mad Lady Malara were clearly well earned. Flipping through the book as he walked, Samwell found a trove of information on silver mining and refining, though the dense technical terms and strange symbols made it challenging. He quickly realized his high school knowledge of chemistry wouldn't be nearly enough. Before he could dive deeper, a commotion up ahead drew his attention. He closed the book and made his way towards the crowd gathered near the citadel gates. "Stripped of your maester's chain and all titles, you are no longer a member of the citadel." It seemed a maester was being expelled. Curiosity piqued, Samwell edged closer, eventually glimpsing the target of the citadel's ire. The elderly, stooped man had striking blue eyes, and a faint, unwavering smile, despite the seriousness of the situation. "Qyburn, have you anything to say for yourself?" asked the elder presiding over the expulsion. Samwell's heart skipped a beat. He recognized that name: Qyburn, the same maester from the stories who would later serve as a loyal, if morally questionable, advisor to Queen Cersei Lannister. For a moment, Qyburn remained silent, his eyes unfocused, as if searching for the right words. Another older man with a maester's ring sighed and said gently, "Qyburn, you are now free from your oath. You are no longer bound to serve the realm and may even reclaim your birth name if you wish." "Birth name?" Qyburn murmured, with a faint trace of bitterness. "I've been here for 40 years. Who still remembers my name now? I've even forgotten it myself." The elder nodded solemnly. "But you still have your knowledge, that should be enough to get you a life of comfort. Just, refrain from pursuing unethical practices. The laws of the realm will be less forgiving." With that, the elder and the others turned and retreated into the citadel, leaving Qyburn standing alone. As the spectators dispersed, Samwell stepped forward. "Qyburn, maester." "I'm not a maester anymore," Qyburn interrupted. Samwell simply smiled. In my view, Maester is a title of respect for those of great knowledge, not merely a position. Qyburn seemed taken aback, eyeing Samwell curiously. You're simply too kind, young knight. Is there something I can assist you with? I've recently discovered a silver deposit in my lands and need guidance on extraction and refining techniques. Would you consider helping me as an advisor? You don't have a maester. My castle isn't complete, so I haven't yet been assigned one. Qyburn looked thoughtful, eyebrows furrowed. Forgive me for asking, but where are your lands? Samwell met his gaze with a small smile. I am Samwell Caesar, a knight commissioned by the Highgarden Lord to establish a new settlement on Eagle's Eyrie in the Red Mountains. I currently govern over 10,000 subjects. The Red Mountains. Qyburn's brows furrowed further, though he seemed slightly relieved to hear of Samwell's substantial following. Remembering that Qyburn was expelled for his dark experimentation, Samwell added, Qyburn, if you serve as my advisor, I will fund your studies to the fullest extent provided, of course, they remain within the boundaries of the law. All the support I require. Qyburn's eyes sparkled with renewed interest, and after a moment, he gave a slow nod. In that case, Lord Caesar, I accept your offer to serve as your personal advisor. Chapter 52, Departure. Walking along the cobbled path beside the Honeywine River with Qyburn at his side, Samwell felt rather pleased. His newly acquired personal advisor was unquestionably skilled, though his moral compass might be a bit questionable. That flaw, however, had led to Qyburn's expulsion from the Citadel, leaving him free for Samwell to recruit. As long as he kept a watchful eye on Qyburn and ensured he didn't dabble in those live experiments again, he figured things would be fine. Qyburn, here's a book on silver mining and refining that Lady Morrow prepared for me, Samwell said, handing the book over. To his surprise, Qyburn didn't even reach for it, replying instead with a touch of pride, My lord, my maester's chain bore 3 links forged from white steel. I'm more than well versed in silver mining and refining. Samwell understood. The maester's chain crafted from various metals, each symbolizing mastery over a particular field was awarded link by link as each skill was mastered. The number of links for each metal denoted the depth of expertise. White steel symbolized expertise in metallurgy. Relieved at not having to pore over the dense, headache-inducing book, Samwell stowed it away and, with a grin, asked, Then, Qyburn, which link was the most prominent on your chain? Silver, Qyburn replied. Silver represented medical knowledge. However, Qyburn let out a sigh and added, In truth, I should have received many more links in Valyrian steel. But in the Citadel today, none are left who can truly understand my advancements in the mystic arts. Valyrian steel signified expertise in the arcane and the mysterious. Samwell's curiosity was piqued. Because magic has disappeared. Magic never vanished, Qyburn shook his head, a smug smile forming on his lips. My lord, did you know that on the eve of each acolyte's final vow to become a maester, they must sit vigil in a locked chamber? There is no source of light, only a glass candle. If they cannot light the candle, they must sit alone in darkness for the whole night. It's been more than 100 years since anyone has lit that glass candle, except me. Samwell raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You actually managed to light it? Yes, though it only shone for a brief moment, Qyburn said, his voice tinged with scorn. Of course, those grey sheep dismissed it as hallucination. Samwell chuckled at Qyburn's use of grey sheep to describe the maesters. And he had little reason to doubt Qyburn's boast. After all, this was the man who'd later create the undead knight in the original story. He undoubtedly understood magic. During this low magic era, such arts may have been akin to mere parlor tricks. But with the coming of the Red Comet and the tides of magic surging once again, the world would soon see the return of dragons, White Walkers, and even the revival of the dead. Engrossed in their conversation, the two of them reached the base of the high tower before they knew it. Suddenly, a figure darted out from the shadows, startling Samwell. He assumed a defensive stance, only to hear the person exclaim, Samwell! I've finally found you! It was Horace Redwine, eldest son of the Redwine family from the Arbor. Horace, what's got you so flustered? Samwell asked. Horace, his face flushed with exertion, orange hair drenched in sweat, took a moment to catch his breath and compose himself. Sir Samwell, my father felt terrible about missing you on your last visit to the Arbor. He sent me here to extend an invitation. Please thank Lord Pakester for his kind offer, Samwell said with a polite smile. But I don't intend to return to the Arbor just yet. Horace stared, dumbfounded. I apologize if you came all this way just for that, Horace. But, what about the wine deal? Horace stammered. And the supplies? Oh, that's all arranged, Samwell said casually. The Hightower family has agreed to handle the sales, and House Tyrell will be involved as well. What? Horace looked thunderstruck, his confidence crumbling before Samwell's eyes. As Samwell began to walk away, Horace grabbed his sleeve, almost pleading, Sir Samwell, House Redwine sincerely wants this partnership. We know the wine trade like no other in Westeros. Believe me, only the Arbor's merchants know how to get the highest price and the fastest reputation for your wine. And we even have traders reaching Essos we can help your brand cross the narrow sea. At this, Samwell paused. All right, if Lord Redwine is so keen, I'll visit the Arbor once more. Excellent. Horace beamed with relief, visibly relaxing. When shall we set sail? This afternoon? My ship is ready whenever you are. Tomorrow. I still have a few matters to attend to. Tomorrow, then. I'll make sure everything is prepared. With Samwell's assurance, Horace finally relaxed, his eagerness undiminished as he continued boasting about the Arbor's vast trade routes and the unrivaled quality of their wines. Returning to the Hightower, Samwell first met with Baelor Hightower to let him know that he'd collected the silver mining knowledge from Morrow. He mentioned nothing of recruiting the recently expelled Qyburn, there was no need to invite complications. Baelor and Samwell then finalized the terms for both the wine trade and supply shipments. Throughout the negotiations, Samwell sensed genuine goodwill from House Hightower. He'd originally offered a per-gallon price of 10 silver stags for his brandy, which allowed for significant profit margins, a bargaining chip he'd intended to use. But to his surprise, Baelor accepted it without protest. For food and other supplies, Baelor provided an especially fair price, leaving Samwell, who usually prided himself on his sharp bargaining skills, somewhat sheepish. Sensing Samwell's thoughts, Baelor said with a smile, Sir Samwell, remember our family words. For a brave knight such as yourself, committed to expanding our lands, it is only fitting we offer what little aid we can to help light the way forward. In high spirits, Samwell expressed his gratitude. House Hightower is indeed a noble family. Should you ever have need of me, please don't hesitate to ask. With that contract settled, Samwell swiftly sought out representatives from House Tyrell. Although Lord Mace wasn't present, he discussed the terms of the brandy trade with Lady Aelry and Lady Marjorie, drawing up an agreement to be finalized at Highgarden upon Mace's return. He didn't broach the topic of recruiting the small folk, he trusted Marjorie would gain her father's approval once she returned to Highgarden. With these matters tied up, Samwell's mission in Oldtown was complete. Although his stay felt brief, his heart now yearned to return home. He had left the Eyrie for over 2 weeks and was eager to see the progress on his castle. The next morning, Samwell bid Lord Leighton farewell, then set sail from Oldtown aboard House Redwine's merchant vessel. Chapter 53, Lord Pakester Redwine. On a bright, clear afternoon, Samwell returned to the Arbor. It had only been a few days since his last visit, but the change in his reception was stark. During his last visit, House Redwine had sent only a servant to meet him at the docks, leaving him to wait in the reception hall all afternoon only to never actually meet Lord Pakester. The treatment had been undeniably cold. This time, however, not only was he escorted personally by Horace Redwine, the eldest son, but a section of the docks had been cleared specifically for his arrival, with several members of House Redwine awaiting him. At the head of the welcoming party was none other than Lord Pakester's daughter Dismira Redwine. The reception was nearly one befitting a high lord. Yet, Samwell found himself growing cautious. Clearly, House Redwine was after more than just a distribution deal for brandy. On the dock, Dismira stepped forward with a playful smile. Sir Samwell, it's wonderful to see you again. You've grown quite handsome since your childhood. The lord's daughter was tall and shapely, with fair skin and lively features, not a classic beauty, but bright and captivating, her few freckles lending a touch of playfulness to her look. Samwell quickened his pace slightly to meet Dismira, intending to bow. However, she unexpectedly extended a smooth, delicate hand toward him. He paused for a moment before taking her hand and, with a gentlemanly grace, kissed it lightly on the fingertips. Lady Dismira, you're more beautiful than ever, he replied smoothly. Dismira withdrew her hand, gesturing for him to follow. Please, young knight. My father awaits you in the castle. Very well. Samwell boarded House Redwine's lavish carriage, which carried them through the arbor toward the castle. Before long, they arrived at the castle gates. Upon stepping out of the carriage, Samwell was greeted by a servant who presented a silver platter. Once Samwell had taken a bite of the traditional bread and salt, an elderly man, likely a steward, bowed respectfully and said, "Sir Samwell, my lord awaits you in the reception hall." With that, he led the way. Entering the hall, Samwell saw a slender, middle-aged man by the window, holding a silver goblet. With thinning hair and rough skin that made him appear somewhat aged, the man wore a white linen shirt emblazoned with House Redwine's purple grape sigil. His presence radiated authority. Samwell recognized him as Lord Pakester Redwine, Lord of the Arbor. Despite the years, Lord Pakester looked almost exactly as the original Samwell remembered him. "Lord Pakester, it's an honor to meet you," Samwell said, offering a respectful bow. "Sir Samwell," Lord Pakester replied with a faint smile and a nod, gesturing toward the table. "No need for formality." "Thank you, my lord." Samwell relaxed and poured himself a glass of wine before stepping up beside Lord Pakester to enjoy the view out the window. As he did so, he felt the man's keen gaze studying him. After a moment, Pakester said, "Sometimes, I wonder if you are still the same Samwell Tarly I know." Samwell's expression froze briefly before he replied, "Now, I am Samwell Caesar, my lord." Lord Pakester gave a small smile, letting the topic go, and turned back to gaze out the window. From here, they could see a garden brimming with flowers, where Lady Dismara and several companions were enjoying tea. In their company was a young man with striking blonde hair, clearly not a Redwine. Though he was too far away for Samwell to make out his features, Pakester's words provided the answer to his curiosity. "Do you recognize the man having tea with Dismara?" "I'm afraid not, my lord." Samwell answered honestly. "He's Stafford Lannister's son, Daven Lannister." "A son of the Lion," Samwell commented, noting the man's proud golden hair. At the docks, Samwell had seen a banner bearing the roaring lion of House Lannister, but had assumed it was simply a trading ship from Casterly Rock. He hadn't expected an actual member of House Lannister to be aboard. Though he couldn't recall Stafford Lannister from the original story, likely a minor figure, he did recognize Daven Lannister, a formidable figure who later commanded the Westerlands forces at River Run. After Tywin's death, Daven was even appointed by Queen Cersei as Warden of the West. Though this appointment may have stemmed more from Cersei's quarrel with her uncle Kevin, it was still a testament to Daven's skill and merit. Still, Samwell wondered what business Daven had here on the Arbor. Lord Pakester soon clarified, "Stafford came here to arrange a marriage between his son Daven and my daughter Dismara." Finally, Samwell understood the intent behind Lord Pakester's earlier words. However, feigning ignorance, he smiled and said, "Then, congratulations are in order, my lord. I've heard Sir Daven is a remarkable knight." Lord Pakester shot him a look, his expression unreadable. "No need. I plan to refuse." "That's a shame," Samwell replied with a carefully crafted air of regret. "Do you know why I intend to refuse the Lannisters?" "I trust you have your reasons, my lord." Samwell was certainly not naive enough to think Lord Pakester was turning down the Lannisters out of a desire to marry his daughter to him. Pakester's motives were clearer than he let on. While Daven was indeed exceptional, he was still only a member of a cadet branch of House Lannister, a fact Lord Pakester wouldn't overlook. But more importantly, Lady Olenna was maneuvering to make Marjorie the queen by appealing to Renly Baratheon, the naive would-be suitor. If this plan succeeded, it would sour the relations between House Tyrell and the Lannisters. Despite Renly being Olenna's chosen front, House Tyrell would inevitably be implicated. Since House Redwine held close ties to the Tyrells, they would likely be caught in the fallout as well. So, Lord Pakester would not marry his daughter into a family that seemed destined to oppose the Reach. With this insight, Samwell didn't flatter himself by thinking the Lannisters had been turned away in favor of him. Still, he was curious about why Pakester was so insistent on steering the conversation in this direction. Surely Pakester wouldn't actually want him to marry Dismara. Or was he simply using it as bait? Seeing that Samwell wasn't taking the hint, Lord Pakester finally spoke plainly. "All right, Samwell, let's get straight to the point. Do you want to marry my daughter?" Chapter 54, Temptation. Not in the slightest, Samwell thought to himself. While Dismara was certainly beautiful and from a high enough family that marrying her would be a leap in status for him, Samwell didn't for a moment believe that Lord Pakester Redwine's intentions were that straightforward. Every favor comes with a hidden price tag. Before accepting, one must pause and consider carefully if it will eventually empty one's own purse or demand a lifetime of repayment. Outwardly, however, Samwell maintained an expression of pleasant surprise. Who could possibly resist Lady Dismera's charm? I only worry that I might be unworthy of your daughter, my lord. As things stand, indeed you aren't. My daughter could hardly be married off to a barren, remote place like Eagle's Eyrie. But if I were to help you reclaim your original family name, then surely Tarly Lands would be a fitting place for her. At last, Samwell fully understood Lord Pakester's scheme. He had to admit, it was well calculated. But, my lord, I've already taken on the name Caesar. The inheritance of Hornhill has nothing to do with me anymore. That's nonsense, Lord Pakester replied smoothly. As long as Tarly blood runs through your veins, your claim to Hornhill remains intact. Don't worry about Lord Randall's opinion, once you marry my daughter, I'll handle any other obstacles for you. Even knowing this was clearly a trap, Samwell's heart still beat a little faster. It was undeniably tempting. It seemed as if all he had to do was nod, and beauty, wealth, and lands would all fall into his lap. But Samwell knew this offer was like a poisoned apple. If he accepted, then the brandy recipe, the silver mine awaiting development, and Eagle's Area barren but strategically valuable land would all quickly become part of the Redwine family's holdings. Even he himself would become a pawn in the Redwine schemes for the inheritance of Hornhill. Still, Samwell didn't actually believe that the Redwine family had any real chance of claiming that inheritance. Lord Pakester's promises sounded grand. As long as you marry my daughter, I'll solve all the problems for you. What a load of bull! For Samwell to reclaim the Tarly name would depend entirely on whether Lord Randall agreed. On the surface, having the support of the Redwine family might make it seem easier to sway his father, to make him reconsider Samwell as his heir, but in reality, it would do quite the opposite. Randall Tarly was not one to be swayed so easily. In the original story, Randall had arranged for his younger son, Dickon, to marry the eldest daughter of House Mouton in Maidenpool. At the time, the Mouton family, after backing the wrong side in the War of the Five Kings, was struggling to rebuild its former strength. Randall's plan to marry his son to Lord William Mouton's daughter showed his clear intent to gain influence over Maidenpool. A powerful lord like Randall, always scheming to expand his own influence, would never permit another family to meddle in his own lands. So, if Samwell were to marry Dismera, Randall would be even less likely to name him as his heir. Otherwise, in the future, the real question would be, who would ultimately control Hornhill, the Tarleys, or the far wealthier Redwines? I deeply apologize, my lord, but I swore to my father that I would never return to Hornhill, Samwell replied smoothly, using his oath as an excuse. Lord Pakester's face didn't change, he seemed entirely undeterred by this response. No matter, replied the Lord of the Arbor. Your child with Dismera could still go back to Hornhill. Samwell's mouth twitched. He knew full well that Lord Pakester's seemingly casual response carried a veiled implication of bloodshed. Under what circumstances would his and Dismera's child inherit Hornhill? Clearly, it would be if his brother Dickon's entire line were dead. Samwell couldn't help but marvel, did all the great house of Westeros truly have a hearts of stone? My lord, may I have some time to think this over? Samwell looked at the garden, where Dismera was laughing and chatting with Davin, as an idea began to take shape in his mind. In dealing with such scheming and ruthless lords, Samwell realized he couldn't afford to be overly naive. A few harmless tricks here and there wouldn't be remiss, otherwise, he would eventually find himself chewed up and swallowed whole. Very well, but I'd appreciate a prompt reply. Lord Pakester drained his wine. Otherwise, I might just accept the Lannister family's offer. As if, Samwell thought, casting a glance at Davin, who had conveniently been presented as his competition. He put on an anxious expression and replied, all right, my lord. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. With that, Lord Pakester ended the meeting and left the room in haste. A waiting butler escorted Samwell to his quarters. After tidying himself up, Samwell left the room and walked toward the garden he had seen earlier. Since Lord Pakester was so eager to marry off his daughter to him, Samwell figured he might as well do his part as Dismera's potential fiancé. If he was going to play along, he might as well put on a convincing performance. Samwell. As soon as he entered the garden, Dismera waved enthusiastically, calling out to him. Are you finished speaking with my father? Yes, Lady Dismera, Samwell replied politely. I hope my presence hasn't disrupted your gathering. Of course not. Please come and sit with us. As soon as David Lannister spotted Samwell, his expression darkened. The instincts of any male could pick up on a rival. Especially when Dismira called Samwell by his first name, her warmth quickly turned David's wariness into open hostility. Still, he maintained his composure and asked, "Lady Dismira, who might this gentleman be?" "Sir David, let me introduce you." Dismira smiled sweetly. "This is Samwell Caesar, the eldest son of Lord Randall Tarley and a pioneering knight under Lord Mace Tyrell. Samwell, this is Sir David Lannister, of House Lannister." Samwell immediately caught the subtle difference in Dismira's tone when addressing him and David. He mused that this young lady was indeed a master manipulator, practically begging him and David to clash. Well, that was fine by him. Without Dismira's encouragement, Samwell might not have had such an easy time riling up this young lion. A pioneering knight. David sneered, barely hiding the enmity in his gaze. "And where is Sir Caesar's pioneering domain?" "Eagle's Eyrie, deep in the barren Red Mountains." "Certainly no match for the grandeur of Casterly Rock," Samwell replied humbly as he seated himself at the small table. "Eagle's Isle doesn't sound too bad," Dismira said, pouring Samwell a cup of floral tea herself. "I heard you even discovered a silver mine there, didn't you, Samwell?" David watched Dismira practically leaning into Samwell, his gaze sharp enough to burn. "A silver mine, huh?" "Not bad," David said coolly. "But compared to the gold of Casterly Rock, it's still lacking." "It truly can't compare," Samwell replied, downing the tea in one gulp. "I hear that among the Lannisters, even their excrement is made of gold." Bam! David slammed his fist on the table, springing to his feet, his eyes blazing like an enraged lion. "Samwell Caesar, do you dare meet me in the training yard for a duel?" Chapter 55, The Deal. "So you're really going to duel Samwell Caesar tomorrow?" Stefan looked at his son with astonishment. "Yes, father," David replied, still fuming. "That fool had the nerve to insult the Lannister family. Of course, I have to teach him a lesson." Stefan sighed, seeing right through his son. "Don't give me that, this is really all to impress Lady Dismira, isn't it?" "Fine, yes," David admitted. Shaking his head, Stefan replied, "Well, I was about to speak to you about this. We've been on the Arbor for days, and Lord Pakester still hasn't given us a straight answer. It's obvious by now he doesn't intend for you to marry his daughter." "What? Why?" David's eyes went wide, his voice suddenly rising. "Does he think I'm not good enough for her? Or, wait, does he have someone better in mind?" He paused, then suddenly stopped in his tracks, realization flashing across his face. The next moment, the young Lannister sprang from his chair, shouting with such force the doors and windows rattled. "It's that blasted Reach Knight, isn't it? He wants to marry her off to that damn pioneering knight instead of me, doesn't he?" Stefan gave a resigned nod. "That's my guess." "Why?" David was so furious he started pacing the room, as if ready to draw his sword and storm out. "How am I inferior to him? How am I not enough? No. I won't stand for this. Tomorrow, I'll best him in the duel. I'll make Lord Pakester and Lady Dismira see who the true knight really is." "And what good will that do?" Stefan shot back, exasperated. "Do you think Dismira is some trophy to be awarded to the winner?" David froze, seething, his chest heaving with anger. Sighing, Stefan tried to comfort his son. "Look, the problem isn't you, all right? It's clear that Pakester has his own plans. I did some digging on Samwell Caesar, and I'll admit, his story is a bit peculiar. He's the eldest son of House Tarley, yet he gave up his birthright to take on that barren land in the Red Mountains. And somehow, he's actually made it work. He's even got over 10,000 wildlings under his rule now. My guess is that House Tyrell has their eye on him for something. It's no wonder Pakester would want to marry his daughter to him." David's face was stony. "So, we're just supposed to give up?" "Yes. We'll speak to Lord Pakester tomorrow and take our leave. And as for your duel with Samwell, let's call that off too. No point wasting your energy on it." "No. I don't care, I'm going to fight him, one way or another." Looking at his son's defiant stance, Stefan frowned. He hadn't expected his usually calm and clever son to become so irrational over a woman. Was he truly so taken with her? Or was this just youthful passion clouding his judgment? Before Stefan could say more, there was a knock at the door. "Who is it?" "Samwell Caesar, here to see Sir Stefan. At the sound of his voice, Davin whipped around, his bloodshot eyes flaring as his fists clenched tightly. Stefan immediately got to his feet, snapping at his son, "Sit down. And mind your temper." Then he opened the door. "Sir Caesar, what brings you here at this hour?" Samwell gave a polite smile. "I thought I might have a word with you, if you're available." Stefan took a long, hard look at the young knight before stepping aside. "Come in." Once inside, Samwell saw Davin glowering at him, his eyes blazing with barely restrained fury. "Good evening, Sir Davin," Samwell said, smiling as he sat down opposite him. Davin didn't answer, only glared at Samwell, as though hoping his stare alone could kill him. Stefan took a seat between them, clearly worried that his son might lose control. "Well, Sir Caesar, let's hear it. What brings you here tonight?" "It's simple. I understand why you're here on the Arbor, but to save you some trouble, I should tell you Lord Pakester has already decided that Lady Dismira will marry me." The news nearly sent Davin out of his seat again, and it was only his father's firm hand that kept him down. Stefan's gaze darkened as he looked at Samwell. "So you came to gloat?" "Not at all," Samwell replied, shaking his head. "I just don't want you wasting your time. So, why don't we call off the duel for tomorrow?" "Oh, so you're scared?" Davin sneered, finally breaking his silence. "It's not fear. I just think it's pointless. Whether I win or lose, Lady Dismira is still going to marry me. Then I'll just beat you bloody, to make a point." Samwell sighed, as if resigned. "Is it really worth it, Sir Davin? Picking a fight with me and by extension, with Lord Pakester just to save your pride? Look, I'll make you an offer, 10 gold dragons if you call off the duel." Both Stefan and Davin burst out laughing. When they'd finished, Davin jeered, 10 gold dragons. "Are you trying to insult us?" Stefan added, "House Lannister doesn't take bribes, Sir Caesar. We're the ones who hand them out." Samwell shrugged. "Everything has a price, Sir Stefan. So, name it." Shaking his head, Stefan replied, "Some things can't be bought with gold, like honor. If I offered you 100 gold dragons to throw the duel tomorrow, would you take it?" Before Samwell could respond, Davin interjected, "Father, I don't need your money. I can beat him with my own strength." Stefan held up a hand to silence him, his eyes fixed on Samwell, who seemed to hesitate, as if considering the offer. "Well, I might be open to it," Samwell finally said. "As I said, Lady Dismira will marry me regardless, so what harm would it do to let you win?" Davin scoffed, "You're a disgrace to knighthood. You don't deserve the title." Shrugging again, Samwell said, "You don't understand. My land desperately needs funding. Sometimes one has to compromise. So, Sir Stefan, are you serious about the 100 dragons?" A gleam of understanding crossed Stefan's face. "I'll give you 1,000. Father." Davin looked at his father, aghast, but Stefan raised his hand to stop him. 1,000 gold dragons, to renounce your claim on Lady Dismira entirely. Impossible. Samwell protested. "Do you really think I'd give up on Lady Dismira for a bit of money?" 2,000 gold dragons, Stefan continued, his tone steely. "You said everything has a price. Let this be yours." "Still no," Samwell replied firmly. "My feelings for Lady Dismira are steadfast." Despite the rejection, Stefan spotted a flicker of hesitation in Samwell's eyes. A confident smile played on his lips. 3,000. As one of Westeros's most powerful families, the Lannisters knew better than anyone how to use wealth to get what they wanted. "Please, don't belittle my feelings for Lady Dismira," Samwell protested. 4,000, Stefan offered. Samwell looked more tempted now, the hesitation growing on his face. 5,000. Stefan moved closer, his voice low and persuasive. "That's enough to fund a small army for your land." Finally, after what appeared to be an intense inner struggle, Samwell replied, "Fine. I'll withdraw, but I need 10,000 gold dragons." "No chance," Stefan said with a smirk. "Even if Lady Dismira were made of gold, she wouldn't be worth that much." "All right, how about we compromise at 8,000? 5,000? All right, I'll settle for 7,000. 5,000, Stefan repeated firmly. Realizing he wouldn't get more, Samwell feigned a defeated sigh and, after a moment's thought, nodded. Deal. Davin blinked, still struggling to process what had just happened. A duel had somehow turned into a transaction, and he could hardly believe it. But he couldn't deny the satisfaction spreading across his face, knowing he might finally win Dismera's hand after all, even if it came at the steep price of 5,000 dragons. Chapter 56, Putting on a Show. The morning dawned, bright and sunny. Crowds had already gathered at the Arbor's justing grounds, eager to watch the spectacle. At the edge of the arena, Horace Redwine was speaking to Samwell in a low, insistent tone. Samwell, my father's arranged for a substitute knight. Why are you so insistent on fighting this yourself? Samwell, struggling to put on his armor with the help of a squire, replied, I'm fighting for Lady Dismera's honor, of course, I must fight personally. Nonsense, he thought. The Lannisters had paid 5,000 gold dragons, he'd be sure to act his part in this play. That's called dedication. Horace's mouth twitched, but he kept trying to reason with him. Chivalry isn't always called for, Samwell. Davin is one of the best of his generation in the Lannister family. Even I wouldn't dare go up against him. Don't think that just because you've bulked up over the years, you can beat him. You'll lose, and you'll lose badly. Well, we won't know that until I try, Samwell replied with a confident smile. You don't care you'll embarrass yourself? Fine, but I don't want the Redwine family to be disgraced with you, Horace said, looking pointedly at the purple grape sigil emblazoned on Samwell's borrowed armor. That's right. Samwell's ornate plate armor had been lent to him by House Redwine. His own chainmail was so shabby that the family couldn't bear the thought of him wearing it to this match. That's far too shameful. Don't worry, Samwell replied, slapping his armor with a resounding clang. I'm going to win this for Lady Dismera's honor. If I can't, I'll be unworthy of her. Horace slapped a hand over Samwell's mouth, muttering to himself, You really aren't worthy of marrying my sister. But if father insists on marrying her off to you, what can I do? Now regarding himself as Samwell's brother-in-law, the Arbor's heir wished nothing more than to knock his troublesome would-be brother-in-law unconscious and put the substitute knight into the ring to give Davin Lannister a beating. But Samwell wouldn't listen, so after he finished gearing up, he marched over to his horse with all the swagger of a man headed to glorious battle. Sighing, Horace resignedly returned to his place at the edge of the field. A loud gong echoed across the grounds as both knights rode into the arena, the crowd cheering wildly. After circling the arena once, they positioned themselves on opposite sides. The squires ran out, each carrying a lance for their knight. Although made of wood, the justing lances were still quite heavy and nearly 20 feet long. Keeping one steady on horseback was no easy feat. Fortunately, Samwell had recently grown much stronger, otherwise, even holding the lance would have been impossible and he would have truly made a fool of himself. The gong sounded again. Both knights lowered the visors of their helmets, nudged their horses into motion, and picked up speed. The thunder of hooves echoed through the crowd as the distance between the knights closed. The cheering died down, everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the outcome. Crash! Wood splintered with a loud crack as the lance tip shattered, sending wood chips flying. Samwell was knocked clean off his horse. The crowd gasped, but the shocked silence quickly turned into thunderous applause. Davin raised his visor, waving to the audience, basking in his victory even though the whole thing had been staged. Samwell's lance hadn't even touched him. Samwell! Are you all right? Dismera ran into the arena, kneeling beside Samwell. Davin's smile faltered at the sight. Why? I was the one who won. Davin's mind screamed in frustration, but he quickly comforted himself with the knowledge that Samwell would be withdrawing from the match. Dismera was bound to be his, after all. With that thought, his smug smile returned. Meanwhile, Samwell felt as though his chest was on fire, and his backside had practically split from the fall. But considering that the fall had just earned him 5,000 gold dragons, the pain was a little easier to ignore. In fact, he thought he could take 2 or 3 more of these hits if someone were willing to pay. I'm all right, Lady Dismera. Samwell struggled to his feet. Apologies for disappointing you. It's nothing. Martial skill isn't the only measure of a knight's worth, Dismera said with a sweet smile, trying to comfort him. Horace stalked over, glowering. I told you to let the substitute knight fight. Samwell straightened, suddenly taking on a righteous tone. I can accept defeat, but not cowardice. Horace was momentarily at a loss for words, while Dismera gazed at Samwell with stars in her eyes. Samwell couldn't help but think that Lady Dismira was quite the actress. To an outsider, it would have seemed like they were two childhood sweethearts. But he would never forget the contemptuous look she had given him 6 years ago when his father had brought him here to propose to Lord Pakester. Could she have really fallen for him after a few years apart? Not even a third-rate romance novel would go that far. After returning to the sidelines and removing his armor, a maester from the Arbor checked Samwell over to ensure he hadn't been injured. Once he was cleared, Samwell went to see Lord Pakester. "My apologies, my lord, for letting you down." "It's fine. The young must taste defeat to understand their limits," Lord Pakester replied coolly. "You may still marry my daughter if you wish." Samwell put on a downtrodden face, as if he'd lost all hope. "I'm sorry, my lord, but I am no longer worthy of Lady Dismira." Lord Pakester frowned, but held his temper and said, "The decision of who marries my daughter isn't left to a trivial joust. As for who's worthy of her, that's for me to decide." But Samwell shook his head. "I made an agreement with Sir Davin before the joust, the loser must withdraw. It may seem foolish to others, but to me, this is an unbreakable oath." With that, he bowed to Lord Pakester, then turned to leave with a heartbroken expression. "Stop!" Pakester called after him. Samwell halted. "My lord." Seeing Samwell's downtrodden appearance, Pakester swallowed down his frustration, took a deep breath, and said, "Then sell me your brandy recipe. Name your price." Samwell slowly shook his head with a resolute smile. "I'm afraid it's not for sale, my lord. But if the Arbor would like to help sell the brandy, I'd be more than willing to supply it at a fair price." Pakester stared at Samwell for a long moment, before finally giving a defeated nod. "Very well." Dash. At the docks, Samwell and his retinue were preparing to depart. Naturally, none of House Redwine came to see them off, and Lady Dismira was nowhere to be found, despite her earlier devotion. Instead, Steffon Lannister and his son Davin had come to bid him farewell. "Sir Caesar, rest assured Lannisters always pay their debts. We wouldn't sully a 1,000-year reputation over 5,000 gold dragons. I've already sent a raven to Casterly Rock. Soon, a ship laden with gold will set sail from Lannisport bound for your lands." "I have every confidence in House Lannister's honor," Samwell replied, smiling. "However, I must clarify that our agreement was only that I would withdraw. If, after I step aside, Lord Pakester still refuses to betroth Lady Dismira to Sir Davin, that's hardly my fault." "Humph, we don't need you to worry about that," Davin replied, gritting his teeth. "If I can't win Dismira's hand after all this, I'll swim back to Casterly Rock myself. May the gods grant you safe passage." With a touch of genuine concern, Sir Caesar offered a silent prayer for Davin's journey, then turned and boarded his ship. Chapter 57, Return. Eagle's Island had undergone a complete transformation. Since the first shipment of grain and essential supplies arrived from Sunhouse a month and a half ago, the territory's greatest crisis had been thoroughly resolved. With enough food in store, Gavin immediately followed Samwell's prior orders, hiring large numbers of wildlings to assist in building up the land. Free meals and lodging, plus work credits. With such incentives, more and more wildlings were gathering on Eagle's Island. The prisoner camp, now rebranded as the labor camp, had grown from an initial 1,000 people to nearly 4,000. The territory's construction had accelerated at an astonishing pace. The valley's defensive installations were now fully complete, with triple-layer wooden palisades and 4 interconnected watchtowers forming a fortress-like barrier. Neatly arranged wooden houses filled the valley, and the foundations of the Lord's castle were already laid, thanks to the hard work of the wildling laborers. Additionally, Gavin had enlisted over 300 wildling women to take part in distilling the brandy. Processes such as picking, washing, fermenting, distilling, and storing the wild grapes were all proceeding smoothly now that they had a robust workforce. Near the valley entrance, the wildlings had even cleared a large plot of land to cultivate wild grapes, laying a foundation for large-scale winemaking in the future. Though it was now late afternoon, Eagle's Island was still buzzing with activity. On a sandy hill by the beach, an attractive middle-aged man looked out with great interest over the growing territory. He had dark hair streaked with hints of grey and cool, grey-green eyes that seemed to pierce into people's hearts. A carefully trimmed goatee added to his sophisticated, refined look. The man wore a cloak of deep grey silk, fastened by a brooch shaped like a mockingbird, a sigil recognizable to those well-versed in heraldry as belonging to the realm's master of coin, Littlefinger Peter Baelish. "My lord, do you really intend to wait here for Sir Caesar's return?" A young man in armor asked, coming up behind Peter. Yes, I do. But, he's only a pioneer knight who hasn't even finished building his castle. It's already quite a concession that you've traveled all the way here from King's Landing. Why not let me handle this business of minting coin? You don't think Samwell Caesar is worth my waiting a few more days? Is he? Byron, never underestimate anyone, especially the young. After all, House Baelish's lands are no more than a rocky peninsula with no silver mines, Peter replied, his low, gravelly voice carrying an uncanny charm that drew people in. He can't possibly compare to you, my lord, Byron said, scratching his head. From what I can tell, while Sir Caesar may be good in battle, he's hopeless when it comes to managing a territory. It may seem bustling now, but he's headed for serious trouble soon. Oh? And what sort of trouble would that be? First off, he's far too lenient with these wildlings. He's welcomed them as tenants, provides food and shelter, and even gives them something called work credits. I did some calculations, and if he actually manages to complete this castle of his, assuming he can even hold out that long, he'll be so deeply in debt that he'll be bankrupt. And that's not even counting the 200+ craftsmen he supposedly hired at 10 times the going rate from Highgarden. Really, I doubt that even his silver mine will save him. And then there's the fact that there are over 10,000 wildlings on the territory compared to just a few hundred reachmen. With such an imbalance, unrest is practically guaranteed. To top it off, he's been cultivating wild grapes for winemaking. Does he really think he can make good wine from that sour fruit? Peter listened quietly, smiling slightly. Then he said, "Did you know? People are much like sheep, they stick together, grazing the same fields, following the same paths, all sporting identical white coats. But sometimes, among them, a few sheep are different." Black sheep? Byron asked, still somewhat unconvinced. Yes, black. They're often isolated, looked down on, or even despised by the white sheep. But often, it's precisely these black sheep who can lead the herd to new pastures, Peter said, his tone calm but thoughtful. Byron, still skeptical, asked, "My lord, are you saying that Samwell Caesar is a black sheep? But what about all the mistakes he's made?" Peter shook his head, his voice now tinged with amusement. "Following the rules is a sure way to avoid mistakes. But to stray from convention guarantees risk, even failure." Byron looked baffled. Peter continued, "Besides, who's to say his methods for managing this land are wrong? To white sheep, the black one may always appear foolish until it leads them to a new, fertile pasture." Byron nodded, deep in thought, though uncertainty lingered in his expression. He sensed a deeper meaning behind Lord Baelish's words about black sheep but didn't dare press further. Also, he found it strange that calling someone a black sheep could be a compliment. Just then, a wave of cheering erupted from the pier. Byron looked up to see a ship approaching the shore. "Our black sheep has returned," Peter said, gazing at the ship in the sunset with a smile of eager anticipation. Then, he turned and made his way down the hill toward the pier, with Byron hurrying after him. At the dock, Samwell barely waited for the ship to fully come to a stop before leaping onto the gangway. After nearly 2 months away, wandering along the western coasts of the Reach, he had finally returned to his own domain. Looking out over the now unfamiliar landscape, he could barely contain his surprise. So much had changed. "My lord, you've finally returned." "Haha, Gavin, thank you for everything." Samwell greeted his steward with a warm embrace. Overcome with emotion, Gavin, who was already on the verge of tears, couldn't hold them back. Samwell turned to wave at the assembled crowd of townsfolk gathered at the pier, thanking them for their warm welcome. "Welcome back, my lord." Cheers broke out in response. At that moment, Gavin leaned in to whisper, "My lord, the master of coin, Peter Baelish, has been waiting for you here for 5 days." Peter Baelish. Samwell was taken aback. Of course, he knew the name, one of the shrewdest players in the Game of Thrones, an ambitious man, a master manipulator, and a habitual liar too, who believed in the motto "Chaos is a ladder." And he was here? In Samwell's own territory? While overseeing currency minting was technically within the Master of Coin's duties, this was just a small silver mine. Why would Baelish make the long journey from King's Landing? Unless, he hadn't come solely for the silver. Samwell felt his guard go up. Just then, Peter, escorted by his guards, emerged from the crowd and approached Samwell with an impeccably polite smile. "Finally, we meet, Sir Caesar." Samwell quickly composed himself, putting on an equally cordial, innocent smile. The honor is mine, Lord Baelish. Chapter 58, Conspiracy. Night descended over Eagle's Island. On the beach, bonfires blazed in clusters, filling the air with the mouth-watering aroma of roasting meat and the sound of laughter and celebration. To welcome their lord's return, the island held a grand bonfire feast. With nothing but the open sky above them, formalities were cast aside. People ate and drank freely, sharing stories, while Samwell's guards recounted their adventures along the way. Samwell himself strolled along the beach, talking with Peter Baelish. "This place reminds me of my own land," Baelish said, his face softened by a momentary hint of nostalgia. "Both lie along the sea, and both are littered with rocks. Although, the Shivering Sea is hardly as gentle as the Summer Sea. I've never seen the Shivering Sea myself, but I'd like to one day." "If you do, you may regret it," Peter chuckled. "It's said that in the depths of the Shivering Sea, great ice giants dance endlessly, stirring up terrifying waves capable of swallowing any ship." "Ice giants? I remember reading about ice dragons instead." "Maybe both," Peter shrugged, then abruptly shifted the topic. "Sir Caesar, do you know why I personally came to Eagle's Point?" "Here it comes," Samwell thought, steeling himself for what was to come. Peter Baelish, the most cunning schemer of the realm, certainly hadn't travelled all the way to this remote mountain pass merely to inspect a silver mine. He surely had his own agenda. But Samwell kept his composure. He was well aware of the true nature and methods of this seemingly charming master of coin. Baelish wanted nothing more than to plunge Westeros into chaos, an opportunity for a man of humble origins like himself to climb higher. As one of the most skilled players in the game of power, Peter knew how to obscure his motives, sometimes even undertaking actions that appeared to bring him no benefit. This subtlety kept suspicions off him, allowing him to manipulate the main characters on the stage to fight, compete, and, ultimately, destroy each other. "To be honest, Lord Baelish, I was quite surprised by your visit," Samwell responded sincerely. Peter stopped, turning to face Samwell. "Actually, I came here to meet you, Sir Caesar." "To meet me?" "Yes. You remind me of myself when I was young," Peter replied, his gaze tinged with unmistakable admiration. "Although your birth was somewhat better than mine, your father shows you no favour, and Hornhill is entirely out of your reach. So, like me in my youth, you have nothing. You're dismissed, overlooked. But like me, you won't yield to fate. I sought a position as the tax officer of Oldtown and increased the town's revenue tenfold within 3 years. You, meanwhile, received a charter to claim lands from Lord Mace, carved out a foothold in the depths of the Red Mountains, and now command the loyalty of thousands of wildlings. So, while you may not even have your castle built yet, I believe that one day, you'll astonish all of Westeros." Samwell had to admit, Peter's words held a certain allure. Delivered in his rich, well-paced voice, they could stir the heart of anyone listening. And coming from a high-ranking lord, such praise would likely have been irresistible to most young men. Unfortunately for Peter, Samwell knew all too well who he truly was. To Samwell, Peter's eloquence was nothing more than the whispering of a devil. And what fate awaited those who trusted Peter Baelish? One need to only look at Eddard Stark's end to understand. "You honour me too highly, Lord Baelish," Samwell replied, pretending to be humbled, his expression a carefully managed mix of excitement and humility. "These eyes of mine rarely misjudge," Peter replied with a pleasant smile. "Moreover, I have always been inclined to offer any help I can to promising young men of the kingdom to speed along their growth. Your generosity is a blessing to the realm." Samwell praised him, all the while growing more curious about what exactly this help would entail. Peter stepped closer, placing a hand on Samwell's shoulder and lowering his voice. "I know how difficult it must be to develop a territory in the barren Red Mountains," he began. "And with so many people to feed, you must be in desperate need of funds." Samwell's mind raced. Would the Iron Throne really offer subsidies to pioneering lords? But Peter's next words erased any hope of that, and filled him instead with cautious understanding. "To the kingdom, this silver mine may be insignificant, but to you, it is invaluable. That's why I came here myself. And that's why I'm leaving someone I trust here on Eagle Island to supervise the minting of silver stags." At these words, Samwell immediately understood what Peter was implying. The man was hinting that he could cook the books. If he held back some of the silver stags, the tax he owed to the crown would be significantly reduced. Seeing Samwell's surprise, Peter smiled knowingly and added, I know it's not exactly honorable, but trust me, this benefits the kingdom rather than hurting it. Our king is not exactly frugal, and these coins would be squandered if given to him. Better to leave them here, where they'll be used to expand the realm. A lofty justification, indeed. Samwell lowered his head, pretending to wrestle with his decision, while inwardly calculating Baelish's true motives. There was no way this man genuinely cared about the kingdom's well-being. In fact, Peter would probably relish watching the realm plunge into chaos. He'd likely surmised that Lady Olenna had sent Samwell to Eagle Island for specific purposes and was now seizing this opportunity to add fuel to the fire. The more Eagle's Eyrie prospered, the more likely the Reach would make a move against Dorne. And if the two regions clashed, it would create plenty of opportunity for Peter and his ilk to reap the rewards amidst the chaos. That had to be his true aim. Even though Samwell had seen through Peter's intentions, he found himself with little reason to refuse. Keeping some of the silver stags for himself would certainly benefit him, after all. Though Peter's plan came with its own dangers, the gains were all too real. As for whether this would accelerate an inevitable clash between the Reach and Dorne, Samwell wasn't overly concerned. After all, he knew it wouldn't be long before chaos erupted in King's Landing itself, with King Robert's eventual death throwing Westeros into a war for the throne. At that point, who would care about a small, isolated pioneer in the Red Mountains? Still, to be cautious, Samwell knew he couldn't keep all of this secret stash for himself. What if Peter chose to hold this over him one day? So, after a display of internal struggle, he finally said, "You're right, Lord Baelish. Also, I'd like to set aside a portion of the silver stags as a gift to you. I know a great man like you, ever devoted to the kingdom, could always find use for extra funds." Peter gave Samwell a long look before breaking into a satisfied smile, as though he'd gotten exactly what he wanted. Very well. Chapter 59, Starfall. At the dock outside Sunhouse, several merchant ships were anchored, busy loading and unloading cargo. One of these ships flew a pale purple flag on its mast, bearing a crossed sword and a falling star. The sigil of House Dane, the ruling family of Starfall. "Captain, there's a lord here to see you." The captain, Gilmo, stumbled out of his cabin, still smelling of ale, and shouted, irritated, "What lord?" "No idea, he didn't say." "He didn't say? Couldn't you look and figure it out?" "Damn fool. But he doesn't have any family sigils on him, so how was I supposed to know?" Gilmo muttered a few curses under his breath but shuffled off the boat nonetheless. When he reached the dock, he saw the lord in question, a slender, middle-aged man, handsome and refined, with a neatly trimmed tuft of beard at his chin. This man bore no sigil, but Gilmo, who prided himself on his sharp eye, would bet everything he owned that he was indeed a noble. Putting on his best smile, Gilmo approached. "Greetings, my lord. How may I assist you?" Peter Baelish tossed him a silver stag and, without waiting for thanks, asked, "This ship is bound for Starfall?" "Yes, my lord." "Are you also heading to Starfall?" "No, I need to go to Eagle's Point." "Eagle's Point?" Gilmo scratched his bald head in confusion. "I beg your pardon, my lord, but I'm not familiar with that place. It's just south of the mouth of the Torrentine River, across the bay from Starfall. On your way to Starfall, if you adjust your course slightly, you'll pass by it. If you're willing, I'd like passage on your ship, price is not an issue." "Ah, I think I've heard of it." Gilmo seemed to recall something, but hesitated. "But, my lord, isn't that an empty wilderness? Are you sure you wish to go there? Your information is outdated." Peter gave a small, calculating smile. "A new settlement has risen there." "A settlement?" "Indeed. The Knight of House Tyrell, Samwell Caesar, has recently established a holdfast there." Hearing that a Reachman had built a holdfast, Gilmo's expression changed. The ancient grudge between Dorne and the Reach was always present, even though Gilmo often travelled to Reach ports for trade. Still, as a Dornishman, he held an ingrained dislike of Reachmen. That place is nothing but barren hills and rocks. Are Reachmen mad to try and settle there? Who says there's nothing? It happens to have a silver mine." "A silver mine?" Gilmo's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Yes, and I've heard that the settlement is thriving. It already has over 10,000 people." "Over 10,000? Gilmo's expression grew serious. "That's not small. When did all this happen?" I've heard nothing of it. Only about 4 months ago. 4 months, and they've amassed 10,000 people. Gilmo may not have known much about managing a settlement, but even he grasped the remarkable speed of it. Indeed. It's the work of a very capable young knight, and I'm going to visit him. So, can you take me on your ship? Recollecting himself, Gilmo quickly agreed, smiling, of course, my lord. I'd been thinking of stopping there myself to have a look. Good. When does your ship depart? We'll set sail precisely at noon, my lord. Very well. I have some matters to attend to in the city, I'll return shortly. Understood, my lord. Watching Peter's figure disappear into the distance, Gilmo slapped his forehead and muttered, forgot to ask his name. Oh well, I'll ask him when he gets back. Wonder which noble house he's from. Shrugging, Gilmo wandered back to his ship. When noon came, Gilmo leaned against the ship's rail, gazing toward Sunhouse, but the nobleman from the morning never returned. Thinking he might just be delayed, Gilmo decided to wait a bit longer. What he didn't realize was that the noble he awaited had boarded a ship bound for Bravus, long since setting sail. As the afternoon waned, Gilmo's patience finally wore out. With a curse, he hurled his wine bottle against the deck and bellowed, enough waiting. Set sail. As the ship cut through the waters, Gilmo found himself musing. Perhaps he might just swing by Cape Wrath after all. Amidst the blood-red mountains, a grand castle rose in stark contrast to the rugged landscape. Atop the castle tower flew a pale purple banner emblazoned with a crossed sword and a falling star. In terms of the oldest families in all of Westeros, there might be a debate. But when it came to the oldest families of Dorne, few could rival House Dane of Starfall. Legend held that over 10,000 years ago, during the Age of Dawn, the first Dane followed a falling star to this place and built his castle at the mouth of the Torrentine. For generations, his descendants ruled as the kings of the Torrentine over western Dorne's mountains until the Martells, aided by Rhoynar allies, unified all of Dorne. Samwell Caesar. Starfall's steward, Sir Ulrich Sand, frowned. Caesar? I don't recall that name among any Reach families. Gilmo stood cautiously in the hall, answering, my lord, I inquired about it. This Samwell Caesar is actually the eldest son of House Tarly in Hornhill. He later renounced his inheritance and became a pioneer knight under Lord Tyrell, setting out to claim Eagle Point. Hornhill, House Tarly. Ulrich's frown deepened. If he's Tarly's eldest son, why would he renounce his claim to pursue an endeavor like this? Well. Seeing Gilmo stammer, Ulrich waved him off. Never mind, you're dismissed. Understood, my lord. Once Gilmo left, Ulrich leaned back in his chair, lost in thought. While House Dane's influence reached throughout the Torrentine River Valley, their reach was strongest to the east of the river. Across the river, the Wild Mountain clans held no loyalty to House Dane. Further still, Eagle Eyrie lay past the Torrentine's mouth, far south across the bay. A reach holdfast, so close to Starfall, posed a potential threat. The name Samwell itself carried a storied history within House Dane. Once, a legendary king of the Torrentine, known as Starfire, had even conquered parts of southern Reach lands, nearly reaching Oldtown itself. Now, with a new Samwell from the Reach establishing himself nearby, what could this portend? Ulrich pondered this for a long while. Eventually, he summoned a retainer and instructed. Send a few reliable ship captains to Eagle's Eyrie. Have them survey the area and report back to me with details. Yes, my lord. Chapter 60, Discovery. At Eagle's Point. Todd Flowers entered the Lord's cabin and bowed to Samwell, saying, My Lord Caesar, you wanted to see me. Yes. Samwell raised his head from a pile of documents and said, I want you to make a trip to Highgarden to gather as many refugees as you can and bring them back to Eagle's Point. Refugees. Todd furrowed his brow and cautioned, My lord, even if they are refugees, they are still under the protection of House Tyrell. You cannot just. Before he could finish, Samwell tossed a parchment over to him. Todd caught it and, upon unrolling it, saw that it bore the signature of Lord Mace Tyrell himself, permitting Samwell to recruit refugees from Highgarden and bring them to Eagle's Point. Todd was stunned. He hadn't expected that Samwell would be able to persuade Lord Mace Tyrell to approve such an order. It was simply. He struggled to find the right words but recognized Mace's signature, and he also knew Samwell would never dare to forge something so important, not unless he was ready to leave the Reach forever. So, he kept quiet. Take 50 men with you to Highgarden. Tell the refugees that we'll provide food and shelter here, and if they work, they'll earn credits. Yes, you're familiar with our work credit system, so you can explain it to them. Also, tell them that anyone who reaches Eagle's Point safely will get a 10 copper reward upon arrival. Remember, as long as they're willing to come, I'll take them young or old, men or women, as many as you can gather. Yes, my lord, Todd answered, even though he had an urge to ask, but what if too many people come? Can we really afford it? But he didn't ask. Todd was finding it harder and harder to understand his young lord. Everything Samwell did, whether fighting, making money, or running the territory, was unconventional, yet he kept succeeding every time. This fledgling territory was growing at an astonishing pace. Todd felt he was in no position to question a lord like this. In Todd's eyes, Samwell might not have been the wisest of lords, but he was undoubtedly the most astonishing. As Todd left the cabin, he was mulling over who to bring along to Highgarden when he heard a commotion near the docks. Another merchant ship? He thought, frowning. Ships bringing food and supplies had been visiting Eagle's Nest regularly, and the fact that there was now a dock here was hardly a secret. But recently, the flow of ships had been unusually high. Then again, he thought, given Eagle's Point's geographical location, it really could grow into a proper port. Todd shrugged it off and turned to leave. Shortly after he left, Samwell also emerged from the lord's cabin. He gazed toward the busy dock, squinting. Unlike the carefree Todd, Samwell had sensed something peculiar about the influx of ships. It's far too many. Even if word about the new settlement at Eagle's Point had spread, it shouldn't have suddenly attracted so many vessels. He'd also noticed that most of these ships hailed from Dorne. That made him realize that his little fiefdom had likely already caught the attention of the Dornish lords. He had expected this day to come eventually, but not so soon. No, wait. He suddenly recalled that the surge of Dornish ships started not long after Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, had left. Considering Littlefinger's inclination to sow discord, there was a good chance he was the one who'd alerted the Dornish. With this in mind, Samwell strode toward the dock. On his way, people greeted him, and he nodded in response. Soon, he was at the dock, where he found a Dornish ship captain named Don. "My lord, thank you for allowing us to dock here." "No need to thank me. This is an open port, welcoming anyone with friendly intentions," Samwell said, noting the flag on the mast. "You're from Starfall?" "Yes, my lord." "Have you had any notable visitors in Starfall recently?" "Notable visitors?" Don looked confused. "Who do you mean by notable, my lord?" "Someone important from King's Landing." "From King's Landing?" Don thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Not that I know of, my lord. I haven't heard of any important people from King's Landing coming to Starfall recently." Samwell nodded, unsurprised. Knowing Littlefinger's penchant for subtlety, he wouldn't likely make a direct visit to Starfall. That would make his meddling too obvious. "How did you hear about the new dock at Eagle's Eyrie?" "The news has spread around Starfall's docks and even further, to High Hermitage and Blackmont. Everyone's talking about how they might be able to stop here to resupply." "Though what?" "Well, your dock here is a bit simple, my lord. The pier isn't long enough, there aren't enough berths, and there's no warehouse for storing supplies or food and water. I mean no disrespect, my lord." "It's fine," Samwell replied, chuckling. "Your feedback is valuable. But you must remember that my lands have only just begun construction. We need time to improve things. By the way, who's currently managing Starfall?" He remembered that House Dane's main branch was in decline, many had passed away, leaving only a young boy to inherit the title. "It's Sir Ulrich Sand, my lord." "Ulrich Sand?" Samwell murmured, recognizing the surname Sand as the Dornish surname for bastards. So this Ulrich must be a Dane bastard temporarily managing Starfall. But he couldn't recall much about the name from his memories, so he mentally filed it under unimportant side characters and asked another question. "The Lord of Starfall is Edric Dane, right? Where is he now?" "Lord Edric went to Blackhaven, my lord. He's now squire to Lord Beric Dondarrion." The mention of Beric Dondarrion jogged Samwell's memory. The man with 7 lives, the Lightning Lord. A tragic soul with a purpose, though perhaps cursed soul was more fitting. The man destined to die multiple times for a cause he had no control over. Samwell remembered that Beric had married Edric's aunt, which explained why he'd taken the young orphaned lord of Starfall to Blackhaven. After a moment of thought, Samwell smiled and said, "Could you deliver a message to Sir Ulrich at Starfall for me? Tell him I plan to pay him a visit." Dawn was briefly taken aback, then nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, my lord."
Thanks for listening.